Hi, I'm Olivia, a cheerful 10-year-old girl with pigtails and a gap in my smile. That was me, living what I thought was the perfect life. Our house always smelled like freshly baked cookies, and my parents, Thomas and Rebecca, seemed like they had everything under control. Olivia, honey, come help me set the table, Mom would call sweetly, like the apple pie cooling on the counter. Dad would come in, briefcase in hand, giving Mom a kiss on the cheek. How are my favorite girls? He'd ask, messing up my hair. But then things started to change. The sweet cookie smell was replaced by tension. I'd see Mom glaring at Dad while drinking her coffee, and Dad would sigh and go into his study. One night, I snuck downstairs after hearing them arguing. "You're never home, Thomas. Do you even care about this family anymore?" Mom yelled. "That's funny, coming from you, Rebecca. Maybe if you weren't so wrapped up in your own world." Dad shot back. I covered my ears, trying not to hear, but their fights got louder and harder to ignore. Then came the day everything fell apart. They sat me down on the couch, looking serious. "Sweetie, we need to talk," Mom began, her voice shaky. "Your mother and I have decided to get a divorce," Dad finished, not looking me in the eye. My world spun. "But, what about me?" I asked, my voice trembling. The silence was painful. They exchanged a look that made my stomach drop. "We think it's best if we find you a new home," Mom said, her words cutting like knives. "A new home? You mean you don't want me?" I couldn't believe it. "It's not that we don't want you," Dad tried to explain. "We just can't give you the stability you need right now." But I knew they were choosing themselves over me. In that moment, my heart broke into a million pieces. The next few weeks were a blur. Social workers, paperwork, packing my room. I clutched my stuffed bear, Mr. Snuggles, as I was led to a car that would take me to my first foster home. "You'll be okay, sweetie," the social worker said, patting my shoulder. But I wasn't okay. How could I be? My parents, the people who were supposed to love me the most, had decided I didn't matter. As the car drove away from the only home I'd ever known, I felt a hole open inside me, a void I didn't think could ever be filled. I stared out the window as my neighborhood disappeared, tears running down my face. I was alone now, truly alone, and I had no idea what the future held. I just knew things would never be the same again. The first few weeks in foster care felt like a nightmare. I kept hoping I'd wake up back in my old room, but every morning I realized it was real. The Johnsons, my foster family, were nice enough, but I couldn't shake the fear that they would get rid of me, just like my parents did. "Olivia, sweetie, breakfast is ready," Mrs. Johnson called one morning. I slowly walked downstairs, avoiding eye contact. "Thanks," I mumbled, picking at my pancakes. Mr. Johnson tried to be friendly. "So, Olivia, any plans for today?" he asked. I shrugged, not wanting to talk. Why get close to them when they'd probably send me away too? There were other foster kids in the house, but I kept my distance. Jake, a loud 12-year-old, tried to get me to play tag with him, but I stayed away. "Come on, new girl, are you scared or something?" Jake taunted, but I just glared at him and walked away. I didn't need friends. I didn't need anyone. Still, the Johnsons didn't give up on me. Day after day, they kept trying. Mrs. Johnson would leave little notes in my lunchbox, and Mr. Johnson offered to teach me how to ride a bike. Slowly, even though I didn't want to, I started to warm up to them. One night after dinner, they sat me down for a talk. "Olivia," Mrs. Johnson said softly, "we've been thinking, how would you feel about us adopting you?" I froze. Adopt me? Part of me wanted to jump with excitement, but another part of me was scared. Could I really trust them? You want to keep me?" I asked quietly. Mr. Johnson smiled and nodded. "We'd love for you to be a permanent part of our family." Tears suddenly flowed down my face, and I didn't even know if they were happy or sad tears. The Johnsons hugged me tightly, and for the first time in months, I felt safe. The adoption process began, and it was a roller coaster of emotions. Some days I was excited, thinking about decorating my new room, but other days, I was terrified. What if they changed their minds? What if they realized I wasn't worth it? I shared my worries with my social worker during one of her visits. She squeezed my hand and reassured me. "The Johnsons adore you, Olivia. They're not going anywhere." Just when I thought everything was finally getting better, my world turned upside down again. I was doing homework when the doorbell rang. Curious, I peeked around the corner, and my heart nearly stopped. There, standing at the door, were Thomas and Rebecca, my biological parents. "We've made a terrible mistake," my mother said, tears in her eyes. We want our daughter back. My father nodded, looking serious. We've worked through our problems. We can be a family again. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The Johnsons were shocked too, and I could see the fear in their eyes, the fear of losing me. My mind was spinning. Part of me, the little girl who still longed for her parents' love, wanted to run into their arms, but another part, the one that remembered the pain of being abandoned, wanted to slam the door shut in their faces. I stood there, frozen, as the adults argued. The Johnsons were firm about continuing the adoption, while my biological parents begged for another chance. "Olivia, sweetie," my mother called out when she saw me, "don't you want to come home?" Everyone turned to look at me. I felt torn in two, caught between the parents who had given me up and the ones who chose me. I was shaking as I realized that the decision was mine to make, and it wouldn't be easy. The courtroom felt huge and intimidating. I sat there, feeling small in my new dress as the grown-ups debated where I should live. The judge, looking serious, peered over his glasses and said, "We're here to determine what's best for Olivia." I watched as my biological parents, Thomas and Rebecca, acted like the perfect couple. They smiled and held hands. "We've worked through our problems," Thomas said. "We're ready to be a family again." But something didn't feel right. I noticed Rebecca glaring at Thomas when she thought no one was watching. Then, the truth came out. The Johnsons' lawyer started asking questions, and suddenly, everything spilled out. "Mr. Thomas, is it true you had an affair with your secretary?" the lawyer asked. Thomas turned pale. "That's not relevant," he muttered. "And Mrs. Rebecca, can you explain these receipts for alcohol and prescription pills?" Rebecca stammered, "That's private." My head was spinning. An affair? Drugs? Was this why they gave me up? But it got worse. The lawyer pulled out some papers. "Can you explain this email discussing using Olivia to access her trust fund?" I felt sick. They didn't want me back, because they loved me, they wanted money. Through all of this, the Johnsons sat quietly, holding my hand. They didn't shout or accuse anyone, they just supported me. When it was my turn to speak, I was shaking. "Olivia," the judge said gently, "who do you want to live with?" I looked at Thomas and Rebecca, the parents who had abandoned me and now wanted to use me. Then I looked at the Johnsons, who had welcomed me into their home and hearts. "I want to stay with the Johnsons," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "They're my real family now." Thomas jumped up, shouting, "You can't do this, she's our daughter." "Mr. Thomas, sit down," the judge warned. Rebecca tried another approach. "Sweetie, we're your real parents. We love you." But I had heard enough. Real parents don't abandon their kids. Real parents don't try to use them for money. "You're not my parents anymore," I said. The courtroom went silent. I saw the hurt in Thomas and Rebecca's eyes, but I couldn't bring myself to care. They had hurt me much worse. After what felt like forever, the judge finally made his decision. Custody is awarded to the Johnsons, and the adoption will proceed as planned. Relief washed over me. It was over. I was free. As we left the courtroom, Thomas tried one last time. "Olivia, please," he begged. I turned away. "Goodbye," I said, and I meant it. I was cutting them out of my life for good. The car ride home was quiet. Mrs. Johnson kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked. I thought about it for a moment. "No," I admitted, "but I think I will be." That night, in my room, my permanent room, I cried. I cried for the little girl who had been abandoned, for the family I had lost, and for all the pain I had gone through. But as I cried, I felt something else too, hope. I had a chance to heal, a chance for a new beginning. Mr. Johnson knocked softly on my door. "Olivia, we made hot chocolate. Want to watch a movie?" I wiped my eyes and smiled. "Yeah," I said, "I'd like that." As I joined them on the couch, snuggled between my new parents, I realized something. Family isn't about blood, it's about love, and I had finally found mine. Second story. 15 years later, a lot had changed. Here I am, Dr. Olivia Johnson, 25 years old, sitting in my own office. The walls are covered with children's drawings, little reminders of the lives I've touched. "Dr. Olivia, can we play with the sand tray today?" my young client, Mia, asks. I smile, remembering my own therapy sessions. "Of course, Mia, let's see what stories we can tell." As I watch Mia arrange the figurines, I think back to my own journey, the nightmare that haunted me for years, the trust issues I had to overcome, but with the Johnsons' love and a lot of therapy, I made it through. After the session, I head out for lunch. That's when I see him, Thomas, my biological father, sitting on a bench. He looks disheveled. "Olivia?" he calls out, his voice raspy. "Is that you?" I freeze, my heart pounding. He stands up, stumbling a little. "Please, I just want to talk, to apologize." I take a deep breath. "There's nothing to talk about, Thomas. I've changed," he pleads. "I've hit rock bottom. I understand now how wrong I was." For a moment, I feel a twinge of pity, but then I remember the pain, the betrayal. "I'm glad you've realized your mistakes," I say firmly, "but that doesn't change what happened. I've moved on with my life, and I suggest you do the same." I walk away, my hands shaking but my resolve strong. As I turn the corner, my phone buzzes with a news alert. Rebecca, my biological mother, had been arrested for fraud and drug possession. She was facing 5 to 10 years in prison. I sink onto a nearby bench, feeling overwhelmed. Part of me feels vindicated, but mostly I just feel sad, for the little girl who once thought they hung the moon. That evening, I come home to a surprise party. The Johnsons, now Mom and Dad, have gathered friends and family to celebrate the launch of my book. To Olivia, Dad says, raising his glass, "Who turned her pain into purpose?" I look around at the faces of my chosen family. There's Jake, my once annoying foster brother, now one of my biggest supporters. My best friend from college is here, as well as my mentor from grad school. "I wouldn't have made it this far without all of you," I say, my voice catching with emotion. Later, I find a quiet moment with Mom and Dad. "We're so proud of you, sweetheart," Mom says, hugging me tightly. "You've come such a long way," Dad adds, "and you're helping so many kids." I think about the book on the coffee table, Rising from the Ashes, a guide to healing from parental abandonment, my story out there for the world to see, but more than that, it's a beacon of hope for others. I just want other kids to know they're not alone. I tell them that their worth isn't determined by the people who let them down. As the party starts to wind down, I step outside onto the porch for some fresh air. I think about Thomas and Rebecca, and about the scared little girl I used to be, but I'm not that girl anymore. I'm strong, I'm loved, I'm whole. Just then, my phone pings with a message. It's from a reader of my book. "Your story gave me hope. Thank you for showing me there's life after abandonment." I smile, tears filling my eyes. This is why I do what I do, why I've turned my pain into purpose. As I look up at the stars, I make a silent promise to that little girl I once was, and to all the other children who feel lost and unwanted. You are worthy of love. You're not defined by those who left you. You can rise from the ashes, and I'll be here to help you every step of the way. With that thought, I rejoin my family, my real family, knowing that while I can't change my past, I can use it to create a better future for myself and others, and that's the best way to move forward. If you were in my shoes, would you have given Thomas a chance to explain himself when you saw him years later? Or do you think cutting ties completely was the right decision?
The door to the commercial department of a large trading company swung wide open, banging loudly against the stopper. The employees, seeing the newcomer, fell silent for a moment, before a flurry of mouse clicks filled the office as they hastily minimized or closed tabs with non-work-related content. No one wants to be in the crosshairs of Craig. The team frankly disliked their ambitious boss, but had to tolerate him without complaint, as he was the general director's son. Benjamin Norris adored his offspring without measure, and was incredibly proud of him. Consequently, as soon as his son returned from studying at a prestigious university, a position as Deputy Director for Commercial Affairs and Development was instantly created for him. The new boss made no effort to understand the nuances of the work process, considered his opinion the only correct one, and treated his subordinates like powerless serfs. At times, he would transform into a despot, easily depriving anyone who fell under his angry gaze of their bonuses. The radio continued to mumble unintelligibly, broadcasting another Wonder's love laments, as Craig, without wasting time on greetings, demanded, "Who is Hayward here?" A girl at the table near the wall responded, "It's me." The man, threateningly shaking a stack of papers, approached her table and thundered, "Hayward, why is such a gross mistake made here? Do you have poor eyesight,
or no eyes at all?"
"My eyesight is fine. I have eyes," the young brunette replied artlessly, more out of fear than a desire to infuriate her shouting boss. "Mr. Norris, my report is correct. I checked it several times."
"So, it's not your eyesight but worse. Your brain isn't right."
The furious man threw the stack of papers onto his subordinate's desk.
"Explain where these numbers came from. Did you not do well in school? Does 2 + 2 equal 5 to you? Have you never heard of Excel formulas? We've got enough pretty little fools without you. Well, I'll deal with all the lazy and untalented ones. Those who don't want to work or don't know how to work can quickly hit the street."
Andrea Hayward, at whom Craig had just hurled so many insults, looked at the papers on her desk and suddenly burst out laughing. The sound left her colleagues stunned. The deputy director turned purple, but didn't have an opportunity to unleash another derogatory tirade. The girl stood up, handed the enraged boss the papers he had thrown, and said, "Craig, you're in the wrong place. The document you're so dissatisfied with is an accounting report. Its author is my namesake, Saida Hayward. She works in the accounting department next door."
"Then why did you respond?"
the man continued, indignant and oblivious to what he was being told. The girl patiently explained. "I told you that Saida and I are namesakes. My name is Andrea." Her colleagues tried to disguise their laughter as coughing and sneezing, which only angered Craig further. He prepared to say something, but Andrea beat him to it. "You mixed up the departments, but I'm glad you did. If you hadn't just yelled at me out of a bad mood and power trip, I'd probably still be sitting here, trembling like a leaf. But that's enough. I quit. I hope you or your father won't make me work 2 weeks' notice or withhold my dismissal. Otherwise, I'll have to go to the Labour Inspectorate. I have nothing to lose." In truth, Andrea wanted to say much more to the nasty tyrant, but she held back. What was the point of wasting her time? The pompous and overconfident Craig was unlikely to realise quickly that his odious leadership style would lead nowhere good. So the girl simply sat down, quickly typed out her resignation, printed the document, and turned off her computer. Andrea reached the General Director's office without any problems. The tone of Mr. Norris, who saw his subordinate's resignation letter and was clearly unaware of his son's conflict with the manager, was almost affectionate.
"Why are you leaving our friendly team? What's wrong?"
At that moment, Craig burst into the office without knocking and said in a petulant voice,
"Fire her. Don't even think twice. Such employees shouldn't work for us. If I were you, father, I would have gotten rid of this insolent lady yesterday."
Andrea, usually silent and modest, was so offended that she became indignant. "Craig, how am I insolent? I simply pointed out that you mixed up the departments and started yelling at me unreasonably."
"Actually, I have every right to point out mistakes in documents,"
Craig snapped back, toning it down a bit, but that did nothing to calm Andrea. "If you only wanted to point out an error in a document, you would have called the internal phone number, which, by the way, is listed under the name of the author. But that wasn't good enough for you. You wanted to show what a big boss you are. That's why you burst into the office and started yelling at me without making any sense."
"You see, father, no respect for the chain of command. Fire her immediately. What an impertinent one. She humiliates the bosses in public, undermines my authority in the company, and this will negatively affect our results. I'm sure of it. She's being clever and pointing out mistakes. And why are the signs in the corridor hanging so strangely? It's unclear where to enter."
Andrea sighed tiredly. She was in a bad mood even without this unpleasant turmoil. Her relationship with her boyfriend Jim had broken down, and now on top of her plate, she had to look for a new job. Mr. Norris shifted his gaze from his son to the employee, pondered for a moment, then asked the girl directly,
"Do you agree to be dismissed today? Of course, with payment of all that is due under the law."
"Yes, Andrea answered briefly, and after a few seconds took the statement signed by the director. "I'll instruct the accounting department to ensure you're paid without delay and fairly," Mr. Norris informed her, "and the personnel department will tell you what else is required of you." All formalities were settled before the lunch break. Apparently the director decided to demonstrate that he kept his word. However, it didn't matter so much now. Colleagues, stunned by the rapid dismissal of a hard-working and modest girl, said many nice words to her and wished her well in finding a wonderful job. Andrea didn't want to go home. She could go to the store, buy delicacies, cook a delicious dinner and celebrate a new stage of her life with her favourite man, except that Jim's workday at the car service was irregular. In fact, he could work, as they say, until the last client. Meanwhile, the girl became sad. She didn't want to be alone now. Andrea understood perfectly well that all her optimism about the dismissal was nothing more than bravado in front of colleagues and bosses who, she thought, weren't upset about her departure. Certainly, it was she who should be sad. Where to go now to look for a job? Would it be possible to find a vacancy with a normal salary, and preferably with a good team? Andrea understood perfectly well that nothing particularly lucrative or prestigious would be available to her. After all, she wasn't a daughter, wife, or even a distant relative of a rich or powerful man, so she would have to work hard and be content with a modest position and salary. Jim was unlikely to help with work, no matter how sad it was to admit. She was just a cohabitant to him, and for almost 2 years. He was in no hurry to propose. Her timid hints, made a couple of times, Jim seemed not to notice, or immediately changed the subject. Andrea, of course, was offended to feel in a suspended state, but she feared that a direct, frank conversation about legalizing their relationship would put an end to it. So now she kept silent about the desired marriage and didn't even stutter about the fact that she would like to become a mother. Lost in unhappy thoughts, Andrea didn't notice that her feet had brought her to the shopping centre. The girl stepped through the doors, which opened to her liking, and found herself in a realm of boutiques and small shops, cell phone salons, and stalls where staff would give her a manicure and even apply makeup. The top floor of the centre was occupied by cinema halls and a food court, but Andrea didn't want to go there at all. Taking advantage of the moment, she decided to look for a new down jacket for the rapidly approaching winter. After all, even despite the dismissal and the prospect of austerity, it was still necessary to stay warm. But her mood wasn't the most suitable for shopping, and after about an hour, tired and sweating, she went to get groceries. The bags were unexpectedly heavy, and deciding to be clever, Andrea called a cab from the shopping centre to Jim's work so they could return home together. At the beginning of their relationship, they'd done that often. Andrea would sit quietly in the room, equipped for clients, who sometimes stayed to wait for the end of car repair work. When Jim finished work, he'd take Andrea's hand and lead her to his apartment, or, if he had a car and the weather allowed, he'd drive her around the city. On the way, they would stop at a fast food joint and pick up some food to eat outdoors. It was so romantic, but lately, Andrea couldn't remember when they had spent such a nice time together. Because of the frantic and aimless shopping, the girl didn't think to call her beloved. She only thought about it when she entered the waiting room to put down her purchases before heading to the body repair area where Jim usually worked. However, her plans were thwarted because Andrea saw her favourite a little earlier than she expected, but there was no joy in it. Jim was sprawled on the sofa, embracing some blonde. That's right. If the day starts out bad, then by evening nothing good will come of it, Andrea thought bitterly. Jim looked pleased, even happy. The man didn't even think of pulling away from the girl, unfamiliar to Andrea, and asked in a calm, not at all embarrassed tone, "Why did you come?" "Just stopping by, out of old friendship," Andrea replied coolly. Then she turned around and went to Jim's apartment to get her things. Surprisingly, she didn't feel like making a scene at all. Probably she had exhausted her limit on conflicts earlier that day at her former job. It didn't take long to pack her things. Andrea grinned sadly, realizing that all her stuff fit into the same 2 bags she had brought to Jim's apartment. She hadn't accumulated much. The girl looked around. She remembered how she had invested in repairs, updating furniture, appliances, thinking that she should help her beloved. What a fool. She hadn't even considered that she might have to leave this cosy place after Jim's betrayal. After all, her friend Vanessa had warned her not to spend her savings on her boyfriend's apartment, but to no avail. They had even quarrelled just a month ago when Andrea told her about buying a coffee machine. Vanessa had twirled her finger at Andrea and, quite accurately as it turned out, predicted, "Jim will leave you. Remember my words. If after a year of dating, a man hasn't made a marriage proposal, then he won't do it, especially when even long cohabitation hasn't pushed him to take this important step. There's nothing to wait for." Andrea angrily dismissed her friend's concerns, claiming that there was nothing to discuss. She accused her friend of jealousy, boasting that Jim had his own apartment and a job. Andrea went even more far. She called Vanessa's Tom a lazy moron. Deeply offended, Vanessa cut off communication with Andrea. Time, however, proved Vanessa right. Andrea eventually realized she had merely been funding Jim's apartment renovations. Suppressing her urge for retaliation, Andrea's better judgment prevailed. She gathered her bags and groceries, locked the door, and dropped her keys in the mailbox for the deceitful Jim before leaving. Stepping onto the city streets, Andrea felt the cool autumn evening settling in. She urgently needed to find a place to stay for the night, but her options were limited. Andrea tried calling her only relative, older sister, but the phone was unavailable. The girl was sure that her older sister Nancy was at home now, so she even got a little angry. Despite their past issues, surely Nancy could have answered the call, deciding that an unannounced visit was justified under her difficult circumstances. Andrea opted to walk rather than spend money on a cab. She headed towards the house, where she once was happy and needed, now occupied by her sister's family. Bittersweet memories flooded back as Andrea approached, making each step feel heavier. As the familiar entrance came into view, Andrea's throat tightened, and tears welled up in her eyes for the first time that difficult day. She didn't have the keys to the intercom, so she dialed the number of the apartment where she had spent her childhood. "Nancy, it's me. Can you let me in?" Andrea asked upon hearing her sister's voice through the speaker. "All right, come on up," Nancy replied. Andrea tried to convince herself that she had only imagined the displeasure in Nancy's tone as she hurried up to the apartment. The chilly reception, however, confirmed her fears. Nancy didn't rush to embrace her younger sister, despite not having seen each other for months. She didn't even invite Andrea to the kitchen, where the sounds of her husband and sons having dinner could be heard. Noticing the bags Andrea carried, Nancy asked flatly, "What's happened to you, Andrea?" "A lot, Nancy. To cut a long story short, I resigned from my job today and broke up with Jim. I was hoping I could stay here for a while until I find a new apartment and job." Nancy's refusal, though not entirely unexpected, still stung Andrea. "I sympathise with you, of course, but this isn't the right place for you to stay. You know how you and Sam can't stand each other. You're bound to quarrel, even if you just cross paths in the kitchen. I shouldn't deal with that stress right now." Nancy stroked her belly, which didn't look especially noticeable on her figure, which had grown fat after the birth of 2 children. Andrea tried to be polite. "Well, congratulations." Andrea's nephews burst into the hallway shouting, "Hello!" before rushing to their room, arguing about which game to play on the console. Their father appeared shortly after. Upon seeing Andrea, he grimaced, not even attempting to hide his dislike. "Well, well, I hope you won't stay long." Andrea shot back.
Don't you worry, Sam, I'll be gone soon and you can continue spoiling my sister's life uninterrupted. Attempting to diffuse the conflict, Nancy turned to her husband. Sam, please deal with the boys before they start fighting over the game. Unperturbed by Andrea's presence, Sam, picking his teeth, headed for the nursery, casting only a dismissive glance at her. Nancy tried to smooth over the awkwardness. Come on, I'll make some tea and feed you. You must be hungry. I can't help with much else, but there are plenty of lodging options now. Hotels, hostels, you name it. Andrea declined, but Nancy, feeling guilty about refusing her sister, offered, At least leave some of your things here, so you're not carrying such a heavy load. You can collect them once you've found a place. I can also ask about job vacancies. I could get you a sales position right away. Thank you, Nancy. I really appreciate your support and suggestions, Andrea replied. I'd prefer to leave my things here for now, and I'll pass on the food. I need to arrange a place to sleep. All right, let's put your things in the closet. Then we'll go to the kitchen, and you can search for a place to stay. Andrea handed her sister the grocery bag. Here are the groceries. I'd planned a celebratory dinner for quitting my job, but then decided not to leave the delicacies for Jim. Too much for him. Nancy sighed. She had never liked her sister's boyfriend. She felt partly responsible for Andrea's situation, knowing that she had moved in with Jim out of desperation rather than overwhelming love. It had become unbearable for Andrea to stay in her parents' apartment. While Andrea searched for accommodation, Nancy warmed up soup, mashed potatoes and cutlets, setting the table and brewing fresh tea. I can't let you go hungry. Let's eat, and then you can continue your search. I'll call you tomorrow afternoon, or you call me. Andrea suddenly remembered. Nancy, is your phone not working? I tried to call and warn you as I was coming, but I couldn't get through. Oh, the boys must have messed with it again, Nancy exclaimed. They still use push-button phones, but sometimes they beg to play games on mine, as if the console isn't enough. Sam insisted on buying it, saying our son's dream should come true. He spent a fortune on that thing. And we have to keep buying new games for it too. The aromas wafting from the food were so homey and familiar that Andrea, despite thinking she couldn't eat a bite, discreetly cleared all the plates and emptied her teacup. Nancy, thank you so much. I didn't realize how hungry I was until I tasted it. It's delicious. As if our mum had cooked it herself. Nancy smiled sadly. Though a mother herself, she still desperately missed her parents, who had died 7 years ago in a terrible accident. The wound of loss had never healed. Trying to cope with her grief, Nancy had slowly begun mastering recipes from her mother's cookbook, which contained the most successful versions of various dishes, from baked goods to winter preserves. You're welcome, sis, the hostess said. After a moment of silence, Nancy added, I apologize for everything, but I really can't let you stay overnight. It's all right, Nancy, I understand. Please forgive me as well. I wasn't very gentle with my words back then either. Probably the sisters would have started crying, but at that moment Sam came into the kitchen and said, Nancy, go deal with your brats yourself. All you want to do is talk. Your real family isn't important to you. Andrea didn't bother reminding him that she was part of the family, and rose to leave. Risking her husband's displeasure, Nancy asked her younger sister, Where will you go, Andrea? You haven't had an opportunity to find a place to live yet. Trying to appear as carefree as possible, Andrea improvised. Oh, I'll call Vanessa. She lives in our neighbourhood, so it won't take long to get there. Nancy, can't you hear the screaming in the nursery? Say goodbye to your sister and go deal with it. Much to Andrea's annoyance, Nancy hurriedly said goodbye and went to fulfill her repressive and lazy husband's demands. Andrea left the apartment and once on the street called her friend with whom she had been quarrelling. Vanessa responded almost instantly and without even asking the reason for the call, immediately invited her over. It wasn't far. The old 5-story building, recently painted a cheerful fuchsia, was just a block away.
and half an hour later, her friend invited her cordially, as if there had been no quarrel between them. "Come in, Andrea. Tom's working the night shift. If you don't have to get up early, we can sit and chat at our leisure. I've made dinner. Would you like to eat?" Vanessa acted as if there had been no spat. So Andrea dared to address the urgent issue at hand. "No thanks, I'm not hungry. My sister fed me to the brim, Vanessa. I have a more pressing problem than hunger. I have nowhere to live. I know your space is tight, but please, take me in for at least a few days." Vanessa waved her hands. "Well, I have no objection at all. The living room is all yours." "Thank you, Vanessa. All I want is a roof over my head. Jim and I had a fight, just as you predicted. I was very wrong about him." The friend, realizing Andrea would share her troubles, didn't interfere in Andrea's confess. And so it happened. It took only one question. "I still don't understand why you and your sister quarrelled so sharply then. Wasn't everything amicable at first glance? You even took your nephews out more often than she did. I'm sorry, of course, but I've always thought that you and Jim only started living together out of desperation." Andrea nodded. "You're right again. I ran away from home. I haven't told anyone about it, but I feel like I'll burst if I don't share it with someone. When our parents were still alive, and Nancy was pregnant with her oldest son, she moved back home. It all happened because Sam started having problems in his business, and he even had to sell their apartment. We were cramped, but all in good spirits. We hoped that soon enough my brother-in-law would earn enough to buy a house again. And then, as you know, my parents died. I didn't care about the legal formalities. I did as Sam advised. I refused to inherit from my parents. He explained it would cost less, and I didn't have much money. I didn't expect any trickery. Nancy and I had become incredibly close. Matt was only a year old, and he, frankly speaking, became our salvation from all this nightmare. Taking care of him was all that kept us going. Then Lee was born, and Matt started school. And then, as if a black cat ran between Nancy and me, our relationship deteriorated sharply. Sam, who had rejoiced when I refused the inheritance and assured me that the doors of my father's house were always open to me, changed. He said my presence was no longer desirable. Nancy supported him. I didn't tell anyone, but she accused me of flirting with Sam, and he, the jerk, as I realise now, managed to convince her of that. But the most hurtful thing was that my nephews, who were so fond of me, suddenly cooled towards me. Today they greeted me as if I were a stranger, and that's how it goes in my life. First everything's great, and then it all goes wrong. With you, too, as you remember, a quarrel almost out of the blue. With Jim, it's not clear what happened at all. Vanessa almost jumped on the spot, blurting out, "Andrea, you must have been jinxed. Well, not jinxed. I've read about it. Everything seems fine, then bang, it all falls apart like a sandcastle." "Oh, it's nothing. I probably just don't handle conflicts well. What's the big deal? Today, I could have simply told that puffed-up turkey Craig that he mixed up the offices, but no, I didn't think I could lose my job and started mocking him. As a result, I'm sitting here now, disturbing your rest." However, Vanessa was sure of her stance and continued to convince her friend. "No, Andrea, all sorts of mystical things aren't nonsense. I have a co-worker. She was suffering too. Everything was going wrong for her, and then one day her problems started falling away, like dried mud, almost as if by magic. Well, of course the girls and I pestered her with questions, and she admitted that she had gone to a fortune teller. We, of course, also began asking to share the sorceress's contacts. Reluctantly, she shared. Only she turned out to be quite selective. She doesn't agree to read fortunes for just anyone. She'll talk on the phone beforehand, listen to just a few phrases, and immediately reject some people, saying there's no point in them coming to her and that she won't agree to read their fortune. She arranges meetings with others. She agreed to see me only once, about 1.5 years ago. She drew the cards and told me what to do and how to do it. Oh, Vanessa, are you kidding me? How did you fall for such a thing? All magicians and fortune-tellers, psychics, and the like are just swindlers with good psychological skills. They take advantage of people's gullibility and swindle money. I don't believe in crystal balls and magic cards. Vanessa didn't back down. Maybe you're partly right. I didn't believe it myself either, but Mary is not a fraud in any way. She doesn't even ask for payment in money, but in products. Listen, Andrea, what do you have to lose if you go to this fortune teller? At least it won't get worse. That's for sure. It just can't get any worse. You just need to call Mary beforehand and make an appointment. Well, shall I give you the fortune teller's phone number? Or are you going to keep suffering like this? Andrea smiled. Her mood gradually improved from communicating with her cheerful and straightforward friend, as it always did. And again, she didn't want to end a difficult day with another quarrel. Go ahead, Vanessa. What choice do I have? I know you. If you've decided to do me good, you won't leave me alone. That's right, I won't. Maybe she won't agree to see me, Andrea muttered quietly, entering the sequence of numbers dictated by her friend into her smartphone. Making sure Andrea had noted the number correctly, Vanessa summarized. It's getting late now. You call her in the morning. Be sure to do it. I can't control it, unfortunately. I have to go to work early. But be warned, I'll demand a full report from you. I'll let Tom know you're our guest, so rest easy. In the morning, Andrea dialed the fortune teller's number. After a couple of rings, a young voice answered. It lacked the hoarseness or any mystical qualities the girl had expected. The fortune teller, Mary, asked about the nature of her inquiry, paused briefly, then agreed to see her. She set the time for their session and gave directions. Meanwhile, Vanessa's husband returned home. He greeted Andrea discreetly, and she, to avoid complications, and not to disturb his rest after the night shift, hastily departed. Over breakfast at the bakery, the girl pondered the changes of the past 24 hours. Just yesterday, she had planned her workdays and weekend plans with Jim at this very table. Today, she had nowhere to rush. All that remained was to browse job ads and await Nancy's call. Perhaps she could find a suitable position. After the breakfast, Andrea wandered through stores, not for shopping but to scrutinize the advertisements on bulletin boards and doors. She even considered retail, knowing vacancies were plentiful in that field. This potential job offered at least the illusion that she wouldn't starve. Finally, Andrea bought groceries to pay the fortune teller and set off. The bus was crowded, with no available seats. The heavy bag weighed down her arm, and she mentally chided herself for embarking on what she feared might be a futile adventure. Mary's dwelling turned out to be a small wooden house, nestled in the shadow of newly built high-rises. Compared to them, it seemed a faded relic of the past. Yet how cosy this relic was, despite the towering buildings clearly blocking sunlight from the yard. Colourful asters and other flowers Andrea couldn't name bloomed behind a low wooden fence. In this vibrant oasis, improbably thriving in the urban jungle, the typical city smell of exhaust fumes was absent. Instead, like a greeting from a distant childhood, the fragrance of linden blossoms filled the air, quite unexpected for mid-autumn. Andrea snorted incredulously. Could this surprising aroma be the start of an elaborate ruse? Is there a hidden diffuser somewhere spraying scent, making the client feel they're in some truly magical place? After such preparation, even nonsense might be perceived so critically. Mary, who emerged onto the porch accompanied by a large striped cat, gave Andrea a mixed impression. There was no witchy flair to the hostess's attire, just a simple, light cotton dress and cosy, thick, hand-knitted slippers. No colourful scarves, amulets, or other mystical accoutrements. "Good of you not to be late," Mary praised instead of a greeting. "Come in." Andrea opened the gate, squinting at the riotously colourful flowers, approached the porch and said hello. The cat leapt down from the steps and rubbed against the guest's jeans, seeking attention. Watching this, the hostess said, "Mars, stop pestering, let her pass." "Contrary to what you think, Andrea didn't come here to pet you, but on business. Come in," the fortune-teller repeated. "Mars isn't rushing, but you and I have work to do. Put the bag on the table in the hall." Andrea followed Mary, then sat modestly on the chair her hostess indicated. The room also lacked any witchy ambience. Instead, featuring a confusing mix of styles and eras, a hand-knitted tablecloth was protected by modern flexible glass. An ultra-trendy ergonomic chair stood next to an antique dresser. A modern laptop occupied the computer desk. Mary hissed at the cat, who was sniffing curiously at Andrea's package. She took out a deck of large cards and began shuffling them while scrutinizing her visitor. Suddenly, instead of explaining her problems, Andrea blurted out, sincerely, "Your cat is wonderful. I wish you'd told me about him. I'd have brought treats. Your flowers are also incredibly beautiful. It's surprising they bloom in such low-light conditions. I even thought I smelled linden blossoms." The fortune-teller nodded silently at the compliments. Upon hearing about the unusual aroma, she smiled and said, "Is that so? You smelled linden? Very interesting." Then she handed the visitor a deck with the cards face down and instructed, "Shuffle them yourself." Andrea obeyed, and Mary began laying out the cards with their beautiful images. The fortune-teller studied them carefully, but, contrary to the client's expectations, didn't begin to narrate past, present and future. Instead, she gathered all the cards from the table again and said, "You'll soon face a choice, to act rationally or follow your heart. Your fate will depend on your decision. If you heed your mind, one path opens. If you follow your emotions, you'll find yourself in quite a tale, and this trial will make you better and stronger than you are now." The fortune-teller fell silent, discreetly removed the cards and stood up, signalling the end of the session. Andrea felt slightly cheated, as the entire consultation had lasted barely 3 minutes. The girl gathered her courage and asked, "Is that all?" The fortune-teller nodded. Andrea, deciding not to confront her, ended the conversation politely. "All right. Mary, thank you." She stroked the cat, which had returned for more affection, and bid farewell to the fortune-teller. Mary added, "Andrea, don't betray yourself. Act according to your conscience, and everything will turn out right for you. Goodbye." "Goodbye," Andrea replied. With no pressing engagements, Andrea decided to go for a walk. The wind had suddenly died down, as if by conspiracy, and the clouds had scattered, freeing the sun from its prison. The weather was pleasant. Thinking she should take advantage of nature's gift, perhaps the last warmth of the fading autumn, she headed to the park a few blocks away. Halfway there, Andrea received a call from Vanessa, who was eager to know about her friend's visit to the fortune-teller. "Come on, tell me how it went. What did Mary say to you?" Andrea's opinion was harsh, and she didn't mince words with her friend. "My opinion hasn't changed. Fortune-telling is nonsense. Mary just spouted philosophical gibberish, generic phrases that could apply to anyone." "Wait, tell me in detail. How did it go?" Realizing the conversation might drag on, Andrea, who had reached the park, sat down on the nearest bench. An old-fashioned plaid coat lay on one edge, but it didn't bother her. She figured the owner might have removed it to exercise and would return soon. Yielding to her friend's insistence, Andrea recounted the visit to the fortune-teller in detail. Vanessa was genuinely surprised. "Listen, I don't understand at all. It's as if you saw an entirely different woman. Even the description doesn't match. But that's not the point. Mary I talked to had a totally different demeanour. She spoke at length, dealt cards and drew extras. She must have talked to me for about 40 minutes. Strange. An apologetic note crept into Vanessa's voice, and Andrea reassured her friend. It's no big deal. I don't regret going at all. I got out, distracted myself from silly worries, and that's good. Plus, I got to pet a beautiful cat. Well, it's good you can find the positive in everything. Oh, and I meant to say, in all the rush I forgot to give you the apartment keys. Tom and I are going to the movies. Want to join us? No, thanks, Vanessa. I don't have time for a movie. Don't worry, I'll find a place to stay. Just let me know when you'll be back. Vanessa gave an estimated return time and hurriedly said goodbye. Okay, we've got to run. See you later. Andrea moved the smartphone from her ear, glanced at the screen, and tucked it into her pocket. She was surprised to realise she'd been chatting with her friend for nearly half an hour, and the coat's owner still hadn't returned. Meanwhile, the weather had suddenly changed. The sun, as if ashamed of its unseasonable warmth, hid behind leaden grey clouds. A steady rain began to fall. Andrea was about to leave when she felt a sudden concern for the coat's owner. What could have happened? Judging by the coat's style, its owner wasn't young, and there could have been health issues. Mentally praising herself for bringing an umbrella, Andrea opened it and stood up, moving to shield the coat from the rain. She didn't sit down, but twisted in place, searching for the unknown owner. She considered the possibility that the coat, no longer needed and perhaps too large for its owner, had been left for someone else to take. But usually such charitable donations were left near trash bins. Who would stage such a giveaway in the park, where the chances of someone taking it were much lower? Andrea increasingly worried that the coat's owner might have had an accident. She picked up the coat, intending to check its pockets for a phone or perhaps a document, but suddenly felt uncomfortable. Rummaging through someone else's belongings felt invasive and wrong. The fortune-teller's words suddenly came to mind. Logically, she should leave the coat where it was and go to a cafe to wait until it was time to return to Tom and Vanessa's apartment. But her conscience wouldn't allow it. How could she live with herself if she'd left a helpless person in an almost deserted park? Andrea bristled at the strange realization that she indeed faced the most difficult choice the fortune-teller had mentioned. Sighing, she pulled a wallet from the stranger's coat pocket. As expected, it was nearly empty. Inside was only a receipt from a chain pharmacy. The name of the purchased blood pressure medication indirectly confirmed her guess that the coat's owner was an elderly woman. However, the payment was made in cash. This receipt would only be useful if the pharmacy had video surveillance and would allow her to view the footage to see who had made the purchase. But it was unlikely that a private individual would be granted access to such information. After a few more minutes, Andrea picked up her coat and walked through the park, hoping to find the owner of the lost item. The park was almost deserted, and none of the few passers-by she stopped had seen an elderly woman without outerwear. Guided by some sixth sense, Andrea climbed up to the stage of the dilapidated summer bandstand and noticed an object in the corner. Cautiously approaching, she almost shrieked with fright, realizing that an unconscious elderly woman lay there. Dialing emergency services, Andrea explained the situation to the operator. A calm female voice advised her how to act without harming the woman and instructed her to wait for the ambulance. Andrea covered the unfortunate woman with her own coat to keep her warm while waiting. After a few minutes, the woman stirred and tried to get up. An excited Andrea began talking to her, but the woman was disoriented, barely aware of her surroundings. and couldn't remember how she ended up on the stage. The arriving medics determined that the victim had a closed head injury, likely not from an accidental fall. The woman gave her name as June Rees, but couldn't provide her address. There were no documents on her, and Andrea quietly added to the conversation. I found a coat that looks like it belongs to Mrs. Rees, but it was quite far from here in the park.
I don't remember anything,
Mrs. Rees wailed sorrowfully.
Someone has hit you hard on the head.
said the paramedic sympathetically. "You need an X-ray and hospital care." Mrs. Rees was unsteady, so Andrea helped the crew escort her to the ambulance. On the way, she quietly answered the curious young nurse's questions, though she couldn't provide much information. When they reached the ambulance, the doctor suggested to Andrea, "We're taking her to the Central City Hospital. If it's convenient, come with us. Between you and me, it's better if someone's there with the patient. Also, since she's undocumented and the wound is likely criminal in origin, we'll need to record your information and talk to the police." "All right, I'd be happy to. It's actually more convenient for me from the hospital. I was just in the neighbourhood on business and happened to be in the park." They reached the hospital quickly, despite the traffic. However, Andrea ended up staying there for a long time. She even received a call from a worried Vanessa, who had already returned from the movie with Tom. "Listen, where did you disappear to? Our pizza's getting cold and you're still not here." "Vanessa, eat without me. I found an unconscious woman in the park. I'm at the hospital now. They're processing her." "Oh, Andrea, it's dangerous to let you go anywhere alone. You'll always find an adventure on your backside. Okay, call me if anything happens." With these words, Vanessa ended the call, and Andrea was summoned by the nurse. "There's a policeman and the victim's relatives waiting for you in the hall. They want to talk to you." When Andrea stepped into the hall, she was greatly surprised to see people she knew very well standing next to the uniformed man. For Craig and Benjamin Norris, the appearance of a recently fired employee was equally surprising. The policeman broke the silent scene. "As I see, it was you who found Mrs. Rees in the park." "Yes, that's the name she gave when she regained consciousness." The policeman began to ask more questions, but he was suddenly interrupted by Craig's shrill voice. "This Hayward has criminal intent written all over her face. She's seeking revenge for being dismissed by our family. She must have followed my grandmother somehow, then knocked her out in that backwater park and decided to play the noble saviour. What was she doing in that park? Ask her." Andrea was confused. The director's surname wasn't Rees at all, and it seemed impossible that he had any connection to the woman. Moreover, the clothing of the woman she found didn't match her son's social status. And of course, Andrea hadn't expected to face such vile accusations for her good deed. She wasn't going to mention her visit to the fortune-teller, but otherwise she had nothing to hide. So, looking at the policeman as confidently as she could, she said she just wanted to take a walk. Then, shifting her gaze to her former superiors, she added, "As you well know, I'm unemployed now, so I can go out whenever and wherever I want." "Check it out. My grandmother's purse will probably have Hayward's fingerprints on it," Craig persisted. Andrea had to explain again, trying to be convincing. "Of course they will, because I picked up the purse and looked inside, hoping to find something that would lead to its owner." Craig continued his accusations, no longer mincing his words. "I'm telling you, she's the one who knocked my grandmother on the head. She took off her coat and then made up this silly story. No intelligence, no imagination." Seeing the resentment and anger on Andrea's face, Mr. Norris cut his son off. "That's enough, Craig. Stop making unsubstantiated accusations. Everything needs to be properly investigated. Let's leave it to the competent authorities. Currently, I'm more concerned about how Mum is feeling than anything else. I'm going to find a doctor. Come with me, Craig, because I'm afraid that you'll make a mess of things here that won't be good for anyone." The policeman, having escorted the men away with a glance, sympathetically advised Andrea, "I'm generally a good judge of character, and a pretty good one at that. Between you and me, I don't believe you're guilty, but no one can predict how the case will turn out. Judging by how this man is acting, with a watch on his arm worth as much as my car, you might need a lawyer." Andrea thanked the policeman for his advice, gave him the address of her temporary stay, and exhausted, went to her friend's house. Upon learning the details of the incident, Vanessa became furious and began to berate Craig. "What a scoundrel! How can you do good,
if you get kicked for your gratitude right away. You help, and then you're the one to blame. Tom raised his voice. By the way, the cop gave you sound advice. You should hire a lawyer. Then you should even sue this insolent man for defamation and get decent compensation. Andrea sighed heavily. Here are the trials predicted by the fortune teller. The girl went to bed, planning to visit her sister the next morning and ask for help in finding and paying for a lawyer. Nancy, having learned about Andrea's predicament, griped. You need a good, expensive lawyer now. You've crossed such rich people. I didn't cross anyone's path. I just didn't pass by, Andrea protested. And anyway, judging by that coat, which caused all this, one couldn't guess its owner was Benjamin Norris's mother. I think it's from the previous era. All right, Nancy interrupted, stroking her belly. I know you. You wouldn't have passed by anyway. But that's not the point now. It seems we can't even find half the fee for a decent specialist. We'll have to raise money from everyone we know. Oh, why did you have to go to that park? You're a fool, Andrea. Sam, present at the conversation, chimed in. Well, you saw an unconscious woman, but why get into a fight? You should have run away from there. At the very least, you could have called an ambulance. That's all. It's better not to even give your details. They'll torture you. In the worst case, which you're now threatened with, they'll drag you through the courts. Andrea's mood plummeted. She returned to Vanessa's apartment, barely able to move her legs over her heavy thoughts. In the living room, another surprise awaited the girl. An unfamiliar man, whose features resembled Mr. Norris's. He saw her and rose from his chair. The man looked huge in the tiny room, and having bumped his head on the light fixture on the ceiling, was greatly embarrassed. Vanessa, introducing her guest, glowed like a sun. Andrea, this is Robert Rees. He's the youngest son of the woman you rescued yesterday, and your former director, Mr. Norris, is his half-brother. The man gallantly kissed Andrea's hand and began to thank her. Andrea, you will now always be a welcome guest in our family. Please call me Robert. I apologize for the unpleasant emotions you experienced. I can't thank you enough for being in the park at that moment and not passing by. As soon as I heard from my brother that our mum had an accident, I immediately bought a plane ticket and rushed straight to the hospital from the airport. It's a miracle that you found her. The doctor said that if it had been a little longer, the consequences of the impact would have been much more severe. Vanessa chimed in gratefully. It's good that your family has a sensible person. Yesterday, our kind-hearted Andrea was accused of a crime by your nephew, her former boss. We've even started looking for a lawyer. Robert waved his hands dismissively. Again, I deeply apologize and am ready to compensate you for any moral damages you name. Craig is young, hot-headed and, frankly, a bit foolish. Andrea, please forgive my nephew. He always speaks before thinking and doesn't understand people at all. Neither my brother nor the hired private detective had the slightest suspicion that you were involved in the attack. I assure you, the real perpetrator won't get away with it. Benjamin and I will use every connection we have to find him. My brother's at Mum's hospital, and I'm here on his behalf to tell you that you can return to work on Monday. The position remains the same, but Benjamin has promised to increase your salary. To everyone's surprise, Andrea refused. Vanessa elbowed her, demanding an explanation. Andrea confessed, I don't think Craig will welcome my return, and he'll be looking for reasons to fire me again. Robert smiled. Well, my brother won't allow that now. But there's another option. Vanessa mentioned you have nowhere to live, and I had an idea. How would you feel about moving to another city? Is anything keeping you here? No, Andrea shrugged, except Vanessa, but I'm already abusing her hospitality and testing her husband's patience. The man smiled warmly. Then, Andrea, I invite you to the town where my mother and I live. I'll provide you with a job and a place to live, guaranteed. You are very brave and kind, and this should be rewarded."
After her sudden dismissal and parting with Jim, Andrea never imagined so many events would unfold in her life at once. But thanks to a visit to a fortune teller, everything came together in the most incredible way. Until the doctor cleared Mrs. Rees for safe travel, Andrea stayed in a hotel room paid for by Robert. He was staying with his brother, but tried to see Andrea almost daily. He explained her future duties in her new position, and she familiarized him with her hometown.
"Mum used to live here with Benjamin's father, but when she left most of her things behind. I don't know exactly what their story was, but my mother took only Benjamin with her. She divorced and then married my father, Kenneth Rees. I was born in that marriage. My brother, who is 10 years older than me, kept his father's surname."
Robert told his mother's life story to Andrea. Meanwhile, the meetings between Robert and Andrea grew increasingly cordial. The girl barely remembered Jim, the traitor, and was even glad they had parted. She realized she was falling in love with this gallant man, and there was nothing she could do about it. When it turned out he was also free from obligations, her joy knew no bounds. A year after Andrea found Mrs. Rees barely alive in the park, the girl became her daughter-in-law. Relations with her mother-in-law were very tender. Robert doted on Andrea, and she lived feeling infinitely happy. They travelled to work together and happily returned home in the evening. Time passed, and everything was wonderful for the Reeses, except that they couldn't please Mrs. Rees with a grandchild. Doctors said there were no obstacles to pregnancy, but it didn't happen. Andrea was prescribed various treatments, but to no avail. One day, Andrea dreamed of the fortune teller's house, with the cat Mars sitting on the porch and washing itself. She even smelled the delightful scent of blooming linden, but Mary herself didn't appear in the dream. After waking, Andrea had a keen desire to thank Mary. She told her husband she had to go to her hometown for a while and set off on her trip. The fortune teller didn't answer calls, so right from the airport, Andrea picked up some groceries, including food for good-natured Mars, and went to the address she knew. However, to her great amazement, construction work was in full swing where the house and well-tended front garden had been. The area was surrounded by a metal fence, and a large billboard informed the curious that a construction company was building a kindergarten under the municipal program. In a small booth by the gate sat a guard who opened and closed the barrier, occasionally glancing at documents from the drivers. Andrea saw trucks passing by, emitting puffs of black, stinking smoke. She turned to leave, but suddenly stopped, as if she'd run into an invisible wall. The scent of linden blossoms was too distinct. It wasn't just incredible, it was impossible. How could such a subtle fragrance break through the parade of trucks? At that moment, a guard approached the bewildered woman. "Hey, what do you want here? This is no place for a stroll. Can't you see there's construction going on?" "Excuse me, I just want to ask you a question," Andrea replied. "I realise the odds are slim, but do you happen to know where Mary, the owner of the house that used to stand here, has moved? I'd like to see her. I've brought some presents." The guard whistled. "Oh, girl, as it happens, I do know about that. I've got a brother-in-law in the fire department." The man stepped back to open the barrier for another truck, and Andrea stood there, confused about the relevance of his brother-in-law. However, the guard soon returned and continued his story with stunning news. "Well, you can't give your presents to Mary. Her house caught fire at night 6 months ago. When they put it out, they found her body inside. The strangest thing is that she wasn't hurt at all. She must have slept and inhaled the poisonous smoke without noticing. But now the house has been demolished, and now work is in full swing.
"Excuse me, did your relative say anything about the cat?" Andrea asked, taking advantage of a pause in the man's words. "No," the guard shook his head. "He didn't mention anything. All right, girl, you'd better go. I have to work." Andrea held out a bag of food to the man. "Here, take this for the information, and to remember Mary. She was a good woman." "Thank you from the bottom of my heart. I forgot my lunch bag today." Andrea added, "There's some cat food in the bag. If a cat comes around, please feed it." The guard assured her he would keep his promise. Andrea said goodbye and walked to the bus stop, thinking about how gratitude in life should be timely. Should she have come earlier? She had been enjoying her happiness without thinking of others. Just as it had a few years ago when she found her future mother-in-law in the park, rain began to sprinkle. Under the flimsy protection of the polycarbonate roof, quite a few people were already waiting for transportation. Andrea stayed outside with her hood up. She was lost in unhappy thoughts about the house burning down for a reason, when she almost jumped at feeling something wet touch her foot. Andrea looked down and saw a cat. Without a doubt, it was Mary's cat. The woman squatted down and began stroking Mars. It didn't bother her that his fur wasn't as well groomed as when he was with his owner. He seemed happy and purred so loudly that it even drowned out the noise of the city street. Without thinking, Andrea addressed the cat aloud. "Mars, you poor thing, will you come with me?" The cat meowed, and Andrea picked up the wet, skinny body, cradled it, and ordered a cab to the nearest veterinary clinic. Mars was examined, bathed, and provided with everything necessary for a comfortable journey. Nancy, of course, grumbled at her sister when she learned what she had done and asked, "And how will your husband and mother-in-law take to this stray?" Andrea confidently replied, "I have no doubt that they'll be happy." And so it turned out. Robert and his mother didn't say a word against Andrea's decision. A few months later, it became clear that the family would be growing. The doctor assured them it was due to the expensive vitamin complex, but the future mother was certain that the pregnancy was a gift for saving the pet. Sheila left Mr. Bailey's room with a heavy heart. She knew what she had done was wrong, but she wouldn't have taken this step if she hadn't been suspicious. She had to find out what was going on. It might even be a matter of life and death. In her early childhood, Sheila lived with her mother in a small apartment in an old 2-story building. She had no father or other relatives, just her and her mum Gina. The woman grew up in an orphanage, got a social dwelling from the state after graduation, studied to be a seamstress, and worked most of her life at the local weaving factory. The industrial zone where the factory was located was close to their house. They didn't need to spend money on bus fare, which was helpful because Sheila and her mother lived very modestly. However, Sheila remembered her early childhood as the happiest time of her life. Her mother was young and cheerful. When she smiled, all of Sheila's worries disappeared. Gina worked hard, sometimes even night shifts at the factory. That's why by age 5, Sheila could take care of herself. She could make soup, clean up, and go to the store if needed. Most of Sheila's friends lived the same way. Parents worked and the kids were on their own. It was a happy time when Sheila's mum finally came home, often with something delicious. They would sit in the kitchen, drink tea and share the day's news. It was great. Sheila thought her mother was beautiful, fair-skinned, russet-haired, statuesque. She wished she looked like her, but she was small, swarthy and brown-eyed, not as striking as her mother. Sheila was proud of her, but this beauty eventually caused Gina's misfortune. Angelo started to court Gina with compliments, flowers and dates at the movies and cafes. Sometimes they took Sheila with them. Angelo seemed cheerful, good and caring. At first Sheila liked him, and sometimes they'd talk about Angelo. Sheila was 11 then, and understood a lot, so her mother sought her advice almost as an equal. "Daughter, he's hinting at marriage. Do you think it's worth it?" At that moment, Sheila was sure it was worth it. Angelo could take care of them and be a support and protection. Sheila missed having a father and envied her friends who had dads. Angelo worked as a driver at the factory where Gina worked. He was good-looking, tough, and funny. He was the life and soul of the party, with many friends and acquaintances. Angelo lived in a one-bedroom apartment, in a better neighbourhood than theirs. Anyway, the wedding soon took place, and after the wedding, it was decided to move into Angelo's apartment. "There's a better school and additional lessons nearby," listed Gina. "Our apartment is old and needs repairs. Angelo's is spacious, bright and beautiful." That's how Sheila and her mum ended up in Angelo's apartment. The man had remodelled his living room, cutting off a small part of it so that Sheila would have some semblance of privacy, and had even bought some furniture for the girl. Sheila was happy to have her own bedroom, even if it was part of the living room. Then the man offered Gina to sell her tiny apartment. The woman resisted at first, afraid of being left without a home, but Angelo convincingly described the advantages of a spacious 3-bedroom apartment and the plans for a second child. Indeed, how could 4 people live in a 1-bedroom? Eventually, Gina agreed, sold her apartment, and gave all the money to Angelo, who also put his 1-bedroom up for sale. Soon the family moved into a spacious 3-room apartment, and Sheila had a real bedroom, which delighted her. At first the girl was happy with the changes. Angelo improved their lives, brighter and fuller. They lived in a good apartment, often had guests, and it was fun and joyful. Sheila went to a new school and quickly made friends. The first couple of years were almost perfect. Almost, because Angelo had a fiery temper and often quarrelled with her mother over insignificant reasons. Angelo was jealous and irritated by what he called her mismanagement. It was hard for Sheila to hear reproaches to her mother, but Gina assured her that everything was fine. Angelo loved them, and a family quarrel was normal. Then Angelo started drinking. He had always drunk on weekends with his friends, and Gina seemed to enjoy the parties. But then Angelo began drinking in the evenings after work, sometimes with friends or alone. Gina started to worry because Angelo had to drive in the morning. Angelo was always annoyed by her concerns, and sometimes he said hurtful things. "I took you with a child, put both of you in good conditions. I support you because your salary is just pennies. And you're giving me a hard time? Get out of my sight." Angelo said this loudly and rudely. If Gina argued, it turned into a real scandal, and Sheila locked herself in her room and covered her ears. She was scared, upset and hurt for her mother. Over the years, Angelo drank more, lost his job, and now the family was supported only by Gina. But Angelo still considered himself a benefactor who sheltered a woman with a child. His complaints increased. Gina couldn't cook, the apartment was dirty, she didn't care for him, and most painfully, she didn't give him a son. "You're not capable of anything, not even having a second child," he lamented. "If I had my son, there would be something to live for and develop." Angelo also started nagging Sheila. Her clothes were inappropriate. She studied poorly. She had the wrong friends and didn't help much at home. Once, Sheila was glad Angelo would be her stepfather. She hoped for friendship, support and a warm relationship, but he never accepted her. Sheila irritated him, and he often reprimanded his wife for spoiling her daughter and spending too much money on her. He seemed to hate them. When drunk, he hurled a stream of insults at them, making them feel worthless and miserable, with unearned reproaches and hurtful name-calling. At night, Angelo kept his wife and daughter awake by talking loudly on the phone and turning the TV on full blast. Sheila had school in the morning, and her mother had to go to work. But Angelo hadn't worked in a long time. No employer wanted an irresponsible drunkard. He could sleep until lunchtime, unconcerned about the problems of those close to him. Sheila often asked her mother to divorce Angelo, but it seemed she still loved him. Besides, where could they go? They didn't have another place to stay, and Angelo was the sole owner of their 2-bedroom apartment. He often reminded them of this during his drunken rants. "You're nobody here. Nobody, you understand? So don't show off. If you get on my nerves, I'll kick you out." Sheila lived in constant fear. She was afraid they would be thrown out on the street, or that Angelo would start a fire while everyone was asleep. His friends, who became more marginal and unpleasant over the years, also scared her. Who else would socialize with an unemployed drunkard? But Sheila was most worried about her mother, whose health was deteriorating. She often had headaches and high blood pressure. The doctors recommended a calm lifestyle with no stress, but Angelo's behavior made her life unbearable. The lack of money and the need to work multiple shifts added to her stress. Sometimes her mother felt so bad that she lay on the sofa, clutching her temples and quietly crying. The doctors advised inpatient treatment, but her mother feared their home would turn into a den in her absence, and she couldn't leave Sheila alone. Sheila graduated from school and entered nursing school. She knew that hard studying was her only path to a free, independent life. She devoted all her time to her studies and managed to get into medical school. After completing her studies, Sheila got a job at a private clinic that paid well. She began saving for future housing, hoping to take out a mortgage in a few years. Her plans were grandiose, and life seemed pleasant and well planned. But everything was shattered by a tragedy. Sheila's mum went to work that morning, kissed her daughter as usual and wished her a good day. Sheila responded in the same way. In the living room, a drunken Angelo snored on the floor. Sheila spoke to her mother in a half-whisper, not wanting to wake him, and hoping she could sneak off to work before he woke up. At lunchtime, Sheila got a phone call from one of her mum's co-workers. Sheila knew her very well. "Your mum is sick," the woman said in a worried voice. "They took her to the hospital." Sheila's heart sank. There was no talk of anything fatal, but with some inner instinct, Sheila realized she would not see her mother again. And so it came to pass. When Sheila rushed into the hospital, she was met by a nurse, and from her look, the girl realized the worst had happened. Her mother was not saved. A stroke. Everything after that was a blur. The funeral, which her mum's colleagues helped organize, and endless condolences. Angelo, who didn't stop drinking and didn't understand much. Thoughts about the future didn't particularly bother Sheila at the time. She tried to comprehend what had happened, and her brain refused to accept it. In the evening after the wake, Sheila and Angelo were alone. Some buddies came in with a bottle under the disguise of supporting a friend who had lost his wife. Angelo passed out quickly, falling asleep on the kitchen floor. The buddies continued without him. Sheila lay in her bed, holding her mother's blouse. The fabric still held her scent. Tears ran down her cheeks. One of Angelo's guests quietly came into her room and sat on the edge of the bed. Sheila looked at him in surprise. A red, flabby face, cloudy, watery eyes, and a stupid smile on his lips. "And you're a real beauty," he drawled, scrutinizing Sheila. It was a sticky, nasty look that seemed to leave marks on her skin. She wanted to wash them off immediately. Sheila asked the man to leave, but he moved closer and wrapped his thick, sweaty arms around her tightly. Sheila realized she had to run. Somehow she found the strength. She pushed the drunken man away and rushed to the exit. He chased after her, but his legs barely held him, to Sheila's luck. "Where are you going, you fool? What are you afraid of? I won't do you any harm. Quite the contrary." Sheila ran into the street in her morning suit. Thankfully, she hadn't changed into pyjamas. She didn't have the strength for it that terrible evening. As she left the apartment, she managed to grab her backpack from the nightstand. It had some cash, money, and documents. Sheila called her friend Melanie and explained the situation. "Come to my place. You'll spend the night here," confidently declared the girl. Sheila exhaled with relief. At least she had somewhere to go and could figure out what to do next. At Melanie's place, Sheila calmed down a little, came to her senses, and realized she wouldn't return to that apartment again. No, she would go one more time to get her things and that was it. She wouldn't do it now, but later, when the fear had subsided. Living with Angelo was impossible. He was drinking, becoming more aggressive and weird, and had horrible buddies. It just wasn't safe to be there. Sheila had some savings, money she had collected for a down payment on a mortgage. She used it to rent an apartment. Melanie helped her find suitable housing. Then life somehow got better. Work, a rented apartment, girlfriends and weekends at the movies or cafes. Sheila even liked her new life. No more shuddering at night because her stepfather brought someone over. No more listening to his insults or seeing his twisted, hateful face. He, by the way, reacted quite calmly to Sheila moving out. "It's about time," he commented, watching his stepdaughter hurriedly pack her things. "You've grown up now. You're not a little girl. You won't be lost. Just don't forget who raised you and taught you. Help me, visit me, and give me extra money sometimes. You owe me." Naturally, Sheila did not visit Angelo, and certainly did not help him financially. He had made her, and her mother's life, a living hell. He lived off his wife's money, whom he had driven to a stroke. Sheila wanted nothing to do with him. She wished she could forget he existed. But how? Especially since Sheila longed for her mother. In her rented apartment, she wondered why they both hadn't moved out earlier. She had the money for rent. Perhaps her mother would still be alive, because Angelo's behaviour had been a constant stressor. That's probably what caused the stroke. Unfortunately, we can't change the past. The private clinic where Sheila worked as a nurse gradually grew into a full medical centre. Luxurious renovations, stylish interiors, the best medical equipment, and renowned doctors. The business owner wasn't a medical professional but did a lot for his enterprise. The staff's salary was excellent by city standards. Sheila had enough for rent, good food, and even some nice, but not too expensive, clothes. Then something happened. Sheila didn't understand what it was. The previous owner either went bankrupt or got into debt. Either way, he had to sell the medical centre. A new owner took over, and there were disturbing rumours among the staff. "A new broom always sweeps differently," the senior nurse said meaningfully. "What if they ask us all to leave?" "Oh, I'm so frightened," Sheila worried. "Well, you, young and beautiful, have nothing to worry about. But I, almost a pensioner, will definitely be fired. Who needs elderly workers anyway?" Sheila hoped the senior nurse was right, and that she wouldn't be affected, because Sheila couldn't afford to lose her job. She had no one, and had to rely only on herself. Unfortunately, the prediction came true, but not exactly. The new owner did start firing former employees, and Sheila was also laid off, despite being young, beautiful, and a good worker. It was a blow for Sheila and unexpected. She had really hoped to keep her job. The young woman began monitoring job ads. None of the available jobs satisfied her. The average salary for a nurse in their city was low. Only private clinics paid well, and working in a public hospital would only cover rent and food for a month, even with Sheila's modest needs. She was close to despair. The rent was due and she had no money. The landlord gave her a couple of weeks. Just a couple of weeks, and she'd be on the street. Melanie, the same friend who had taken Sheila in a few years ago, helped her again. Why are you so hung up on being a nurse? What else can I do? Sheila waved her hands. There are plenty of other jobs for people with your education. Like what? Well, for example, here. Melanie took a folded newspaper from her purse. It had been a long time since Sheila had seen a real newspaper. This edition consisted entirely of job ads. What's this? I've been looking at job openings in my spare time, Melanie explained. I even highlighted an ad you should pay attention to. Study it carefully. I think you'll find something. Sheila took the newspaper and read the circled ads. They were all vacancies for caregivers. A medical degree was encouraged. Sheila smiled. How had she not realized this herself? The next day, she started calling potential employers. Some had already found a caregiver, some offered too low a payment, and some needed a male assistant because the patient had to be carried to the bathroom. Sheila almost despaired, but finally found a suitable option. She was invited to an interview. A couple of hours after the reassuring call, Sheila stood in front of a luxurious mansion. A wealthy family obviously lived here. Sheila even hesitated. Would such a family hire her, a simple girl? A woman in a strict blue dress with an impenetrable face met her and escorted her inside. Sheila felt dizzy. Such spaciousness, such luxury. She had only seen such interiors in TV shows about the rich. Have a seat, said the woman in the blue dress, and Sheila meekly sat on the soft sofa. Soon a man in his 50s came down the wide staircase. He greeted Sheila and sat across from her. His grey, attentive eyes examined her. You're so young, he said. Can you manage? I have experience with difficult patients. I worked as a nurse in a hospital for several years, and... The conversation continued in a businesslike manner. The man with grey eyes was interested in Sheila's education, experience and skills. She answered honestly and directly, and she could tell from his expression that he was satisfied with her responses. Well, from the looks of it, you seem to be a good fit for us. Do you have any questions? Of course, Sheila had questions. She already knew her potential salary, which she had been informed of over the phone, and she was more than satisfied with the amount, because the salary offered was even more than what she earned at the hospital. However, Sheila was genuinely interested in learning about her ward. Mr. Bailey hardly ever gets out of bed, the man began. He has a serious diagnosis, and nothing can be done, even with his connections and money. He is slowly fading away, losing strength. He needs someone to help him during the day, to give him medicine, adjust his pillows, listen to him, and entertain him with a story. I see that you are an open, kind person, and that's what we need. Your medical degree is perfect because Mr. Bailey sometimes needs injections. Can you manage? Of course, Sheila replied immediately. Then the man with grey, attentive eyes took her to meet her employer. Mr. Bailey was lying in a spacious, bright bedroom. There was a slight odour of medicines, but overall the air was fresh and cool. Usually, in the wards of seriously ill people, there is a heavy, repulsive odour, but here it was different. Sheila liked it very much. Mr. Bailey was a thin, pale man, with dark, short-cropped hair, and brown, almost black, intelligent eyes. Here, Mr. Bailey, I found you a day nurse. My name is Sheila. How do you do? Said Sheila. Mr. Bailey looked at her with a warm, friendly expression and even managed to smile. Nice to meet you. Thank you, I'm fine, and I'll try to give you as little trouble as possible. Sheila was surprised. She had expected to help a capricious man who would demand the impossible and berate her at every turn. She was ready to tolerate it for the sake of money, as she had no other option. But these kind words took her aback. Perhaps Mr. Bailey would show his true colours later. However, Mr. Bailey turned out to be a pleasant, tactful, intelligent and respectful man. With the household helpers, of whom there were many, he was impeccably polite and did not offend anyone regarding their salary. These people responded in kind. They loved and respected him. Mr. Bailey was also aware of his subordinates' problems. For instance, he helped obtain expensive medicine for the maid's son. He also arranged a hospital stay for the gardener's mother, paid for the cook's daughter's camp trip, and found a clinic for the manager's son. The very man with grey eyes who had met Sheila on her first day. The boy suffered from addiction and was literally dying. Mr. Bailey gave him a chance for a happy life. He had money and connections, and used them to make others happy. Sheila and Mr. Bailey became fast friends. After learning the young nurse's story, he respected her greatly. "You are a strong girl," he said. "Another person in your place might have broken down. Many start drinking, going out, living recklessly. But you stood firm. You have a strong core." Sheila was pleased with this praise. They spent a lot of time together. Mr. Bailey rarely got up and often needed help. His sociable nature did not tolerate loneliness. Despite his illness, he still enjoyed conversations and preferred being around people. He constantly had visitors, former colleagues, friends and relatives. The servants were always around as well. Sheila, too, became friends with the kind and friendly Mr. Bailey. From the doctor who visited almost daily, Sheila learned about his diagnosis. It left no chance for recovery, which felt hurtful and unfair. Such a good man, not even that old, exuded warmth and kindness. Everyone around him felt good, calm and pleasant, yet his fate was so harsh. Sheila talked a lot with Mr. Bailey, and the household helpers also shared stories about him, always speaking highly of him. Mr. Bailey came from a poor village family. From childhood he showed talent in various sciences, so after graduating from village school, he moved to the city and entered a prestigious faculty where they trained aviation engineers. He studied and worked part-time in a design bureau. The idea of creating his own manufacturing company came to him just then. After graduating from university, he got a job at a factory, but never forgot his dream. He saved money, made connections, and gathered information. Finally, the happy moment arrived. Mr. Bailey found a company that did special devices for small airplanes, used in agriculture. Initially it was tough. He steadily went into debt, with savings rapidly depleting. He had almost decided that it wouldn't work out when luck struck. The newly founded company received its first large order, which the staff completed excellently, and everything took off from there. An important customer gave them good publicity in the right circles, leading to a flood of orders. The firm grew, strengthened and developed, soon becoming a full-fledged large company with corresponding profits. Mr. Bailey was dating a girl he had been fond of since university days, Danielle. They met once at a student party. Mr. Bailey immediately realized he was in love, but Danielle had doubts. She was beautiful, with thick, long, honey-coloured hair, big blue eyes and a gorgeous figure. Many guys were interested in her back then, and such a rich choice was confusing. Danielle liked Mr. Bailey. He was kind, reliable and genuine. However, she wanted a beautiful life and thought her looks deserved it. But Mr. Bailey was not rich at that time. However, when his business started doing well, fate brought them together again. Both decided their meeting was not accidental, and they became a couple. Mr. Bailey felt truly happy. He had money, a favourite business, and Danielle by his side. She was gentle, loving, and understanding. By that time, she could appreciate Mr. Bailey's qualities, having learned from past mistakes. Soon, Mr. Bailey could afford a huge house in an elite neighbourhood. They assumed they would have children soon, and there would be enough room for more than one baby. Mr. Bailey and Danielle dreamed of having many children. However, these plans did not come true. Year after year passed, and the long-awaited child never appeared. One day, Danielle told someone she ended her pregnancy years ago. She blamed herself and even suggested Mr. Bailey leave her for a normal wife, without such a past. Of course, he didn't want to think about that. They began many years of visiting doctors, but nothing helped. Expensive injections and innovative techniques were all in vain. Luckily, for Mr. Bailey, he had his own business, and the work took a lot of his time and required full commitment, so he had something to do. But Danielle turned from a cheerful and gentle wife into a suffering person, blaming everyone and everything for her unhappiness or lack of empathy. She was fixated on unattainable motherhood, couldn't find peace, and was angry at Mr. Bailey for spending so much time on work and not suffering enough with her. Mr. Bailey suggested his wife join a volunteer organisation, since she wanted a child so much. These people visited orphanages and helped orphans. He even sponsored a couple of orphanages, hoping Danielle would visit them and find out what they needed. Initially, Danielle seemed enthusiastic, but it didn't last long. The children, often ill-mannered, noisy, or even sick, repelled her. She didn't want to see them, so she quickly withdrew and immersed herself in her own suffering again. Mr. Bailey continued to help orphanages on his own. He liked seeing the gratitude of the staff and feeling that he was making the orphans a little happier. After all, that's why we are given the strength and opportunity to support those who are weaker. Danielle and Mr. Bailey became very distant. They didn't understand each other and often quarrelled. Danielle accused Mr. Bailey of being inattentive and stiff, although these were unfair reproaches. Mr. Bailey missed the former Danielle, their heart-to-heart talks, and the warmth and tenderness that had once been between them. Then she appeared in his life, a young woman, modest, quiet, incredibly beautiful and touching, and very sincere. That's what finally captivated Mr. Bailey. He rarely met such people. Gina worked in a factory that made overalls for his company. One day, Mr. Bailey went to the factory director on business and accidentally ran into her in the corridor. It was like a lightning strike. At first glance, Gina didn't seem special. Minimal makeup and a modest dress that hid the advantages of her graceful figure. But Mr. Bailey couldn't tear himself away from her radiant, gentle, attractive eyes. He plucked up the courage to meet her and learned her name. They made casual conversation, and he felt warmth and sympathy from Gina. Mr. Bailey did a dishonest thing. He hid from Gina that he was married, otherwise she would never have agreed to meet him. He didn't think about the future at that moment. The truth would come out eventually, and he didn't worry about Danielle's feelings. It seemed to him that they had long been strangers. With Gina it was different. She wrapped Mr. Bailey with care, like a warm blanket. In turn, he took care of her, bought her beautiful clothes, supported her morally, and even helped get her salary raised. Gina was embarrassed by the expensive gifts, but she clearly enjoyed Mr. Bailey's care. Gina had a complicated past. Growing up in an orphanage, she didn't know the love of family and gratefully accepted Mr. Bailey's courtship. At the time, Mr. Bailey admitted he was married. They had been dating for a couple of months. Her beautiful blue eyes reflected pain and despair. She looked at Mr. Bailey as if he were a great disappointment. "My wife and I have been strangers for a long time. She doesn't understand me and I don't understand her. We will divorce," Mr. Bailey said, realizing how banal his words sounded. Typical excuses for an unfaithful husband. Gina left him, not just because he was married, but because he had deceived her for so long. Mr. Bailey didn't know where Gina lived, but he waited for her in the evenings at the factory gate, confessed his love, and begged her to return. One day, Gina asked him without emotion not to bother her any more. "I have a boyfriend and he is honest with me and unmarried. We are serious, so please do not bother me any more." Gina's gaze was cold, her voice hard. Mr. Bailey probably wouldn't have backed down from her, but then it became clear that Danielle was expecting a child, a long-awaited event, which no one had almost hoped for. Another IVF treatment at the Capital Clinic yielded this result. Danielle seemed to be flying around the house on wings. Her endless reproaches and incessant suffering were gone. Her eyes now beamed with happiness. She needed the protection and support of her spouse, and so Mr. Bailey decided to leave Gina. Especially since he had a child on the way, who would need a father? His heart ached. Some inner instinct told him he was missing something critical, something that could not be regained. Mr. Bailey longed for Gina's touch, for her eyes, but the new circumstances dictated a new line of behaviour. Mr. Bailey stayed with his family. Danielle's pregnancy was difficult, and she went to the hospital to preserve it. Both spouses were constantly anxious for their future baby. Would they be able to carry him to term? Another chance to become parents seemed unlikely. Trey was born prematurely, but was quite viable. The baby had to spend a couple of months in the hospital. But then there was a solemn discharge with many guests, animators, a huge cake, and baskets of flowers. Danielle felt truly happy. Mr. Bailey saw this and was happy for her. He was also proud of becoming a father. He had a son, a future assistant, the successor of the furniture company, and a best friend. The new role and emotions associated with it almost completely pushed thoughts of Gina out of Mr. Bailey's mind. And then there was a lot of work. Only occasionally did he dream of her beautiful blue eyes, clear and transparent like mountain lakes. And then his heart clenched with longing for her. Mr. Bailey sometimes came to the factory where Gina worked for business matters. He carefully looked around in the hope of seeing her, but she was nowhere to be found. Maybe she had resigned from her new job. But he did not try to find out specifically. It was better to forget about Gina. He had a son now. She had a boyfriend. She told him so herself. So what was the point of all this nonsense? Why am I telling you this story? Mr. Bailey looked at the hushed Sheila with a smile. You see, if you meet love, true love, never trade it for anything. Fight for it to the end. Only then in your later years will you realize that you did everything right in this life. You can always find a way to arrange everything, to ensure you don't miss your happiness and don't leave others unhappy. I guess you're young. I don't think you know what I mean. Sheila perhaps did not fully understand her wise employer, but she felt his longing for this Gina. Wow, they only met for 2 months, and he remembers her all his life. Even now, being heavily burdened, he regrets missing her then. That's the feeling. Sheila suddenly realized that she dreamed of someday loving someone just as much. Little Trey was the light in the window for the expectant parents, the wonder of wonders, the crown prince. Needless to say, the baby was spoiled, piled with expensive toys and enveloped in care. Both mother and father seemed to live for the sake of this handsome boy. Mr. Bailey had many plans for his son. He saw him as an intelligent, strong young man, grasping, but also kind and compassionate. But Trey grew up, as it often happens, not at all how his parents imagined. Spoiled, capricious, selfish. Pronouncing these epithets only about his son, Mr. Bailey shook his head. My fault. My fault. I worked a lot. Convinced myself it was for his sake and his future. I wanted to leave him an empire, to develop and strengthen. But no way. At first everything was fine. Danielle zealously took on the development of her baby, infant fable, speed reading courses for preschoolers, mental math, school preparation with college professors, and admission to the city's most prestigious school. Here, Mr. Bailey had to use his connections. Despite the efforts of tutors, Trey did not score the passing marks independently. Then, the influential father often had to use his power and importance to support his son. He didn't like it. It seemed wrong. But Danielle always convinced her husband that he had to promote their only offspring by any means. Danielle loved Trey. All mothers love their children, but in Danielle's case, it turned into something almost pathological. She forgave him everything, organized his life and leisure so he did not face difficulties and did not get upset unnecessarily. Trey was so sensitive to failures, sobbing, suffering, and having long headaches afterwards. Of course, in such conditions, the boy couldn't grow up differently. He believed the whole world revolved around him, and knew that if he complained to his mother or made a sad face, she would do whatever was necessary. Mr. Bailey didn't agree with these methods of upbringing. He tried to argue with his wife, but "You don't know how to bring up children, and I've read a lot of literature. This is how free individuals, confident and happy people grow. You have no idea how many traumas we all have from childhood. They prevent us from moving forward in life, cut off our wings. This won't happen to Trey." If Mr. Bailey continued to insist, Danielle would use iron arguments. "You're at work all the time. You don't show up at home. You're not particularly interested in the child. You don't know what he lives for, what he breathes." Here Mr. Bailey shut up, gave up because Danielle was right. He spent a lot of time at work and had no idea how to bring up children. His wife, of course, had a much better grasp of the matter. When it was time for university, it became clear that Trey's knowledge was not even enough for the minimum grade required for a fee-paying department. This was surprising, given that he attended a prestigious school. Trey's grades were always excellent, so Mr. Bailey was shocked by this outcome. He believed his son's knowledge was sufficient. Yes, Trey was immature, dependent and capricious, but he was diligent and intelligent in his studies. But it turned out that Danielle had been solving her son's academic issues by bribing the teachers, ensuring Trey received good grades. Mr. Bailey was distressed. He realized it had been a mistake to distance himself from his son's education. Meanwhile, Trey became a design student at the local college, choosing his own field. Although he aspired to study in prestigious universities, Mr. Bailey knew his unprepared son needed close parental supervision. Trey studied at the local college for a few months and then disappeared, taking a substantial amount of money from the safe. Danielle was distraught, constantly taking sedatives. Surprisingly, Mr. Bailey felt a sense of relief. At last, his son had made a decisive and courageous move. He assumed Trey had gone to the capital to pursue his dreams and try to make his own way. Even if he failed, the attempt itself was worthwhile. Later, it was confirmed that Trey had indeed gone to the capital. He neither studied nor worked there. He squandered his father's money, surfing the internet, searching for design courses, starting and abandoning them as soon as they became boring or difficult. When the money ran out, Trey called, asking for a transfer. Danielle, of course, complied with his request, willing to do anything to keep his favour. Mr. Bailey had he been consulted, would have acted differently. He wouldn't have given money to his audacious son, forcing him to either return home or earn his own way. But arguing with Danielle about Trey was futile. What if he starves without money? What if he turns to crime to get money and ends up in trouble? How could we live with that, knowing it was our fault for not helping our little one in a difficult moment? Trey stayed in the capital, fully supported by his father. He called his parents only when he needed money, speaking about his life briefly and reluctantly, as if these conversations were a burden. Trey tried various fields. He worked as a photo model, played in a rock band, attempted to start a business with his father's money, and dabbled in psychology, but he never succeeded. Mr. Bailey understood why. Trey wasn't used to working hard. He grew up in comfortable conditions, unfamiliar with facing difficulties. He preferred an easy, enjoyable life. That's how he lived. Nightclubs, beautiful girls attracted to his money, or rather his father's money. Fun friends and companions who loved living off others. Trey had a couple of run-ins with the police, and Mr. Bailey managed to get him out of trouble each time, but it cost him a lot of stress, effort and money. And then Danielle fell ill. Mr. Bailey suspected that nerves were to blame. She was distressed about her son. She dreamed that Trey would marry, become a model family man, and be his father's right hand. Her heart condition, which had been dormant since birth, became more acute and began to progress. Danielle knew about her condition, but it had never troubled her before. Now it started to worsen. Danielle weakened rapidly. She was constantly in hospitals and underwent several surgeries. During one of them, she did not survive. Her weakened body couldn't withstand another intervention. Mr. Bailey felt as if the ground had been knocked out from under his feet. All these years, he knew he had her, reliable, needing his protection and care, and at the same time giving him strength and motivation to conquer new heights. After his wife left him, Mr. Bailey felt utterly alone. Yes, he had a son, but Trey had grown up and become a stranger. Mr. Bailey didn't even know what to talk to him about, or how to support him in their grief. Trey was also shaken by his mother's death. Danielle was the most dear person to him. The young man looked lost. Mr. Bailey even felt sorry for him. For the first time, he saw his son so weak and unsure of himself. However, Trey quickly regained his composure and left for the capital. He found his hometown boring and cramped. The requests for money transfers continued, but now Trey addressed his father directly. Sometimes he didn't even thank him, thinking it was how things should be. Mr. Bailey transferred the sums his son requested, probably in memory of Danielle. As the years passed, nothing changed. Trey still lived his life in the capital. He became a father but did not live with the mother of his child, and did not communicate at all. Trey was unemployed, so taking alimony from him was impossible. The woman didn't register Trey as the father, and Mr. Bailey, he wanted to see his grandson and participate in his life, but he didn't even know about his existence at first. He found out about the boy accidentally and had no idea where to look for him. Trey, of course, did not confess and answered all questions by saying it was his personal affair and his father shouldn't interfere. Then Mr. Bailey himself fell ill. The diagnosis was disappointing, but he fought and remained on his feet for a long time, despite much more pessimistic forecasts from doctors. Yet the disease took its toll and eventually laid him low. Trey periodically came from the capital to visit his father. Sheila saw him, handsome, dapper, stylish, and expensively dressed, strong-willed with a prominent chin, sharp cheekbones and bushy eyebrows. A typical soap opera heartthrob. No wonder he had plenty of girls. They always paid attention to him. During those visits, Sheila had noticed something, and it kept her on edge, and she needed to test her suspicions. During her time in that beautiful house, Mr. Bailey had become familiar to Sheila, but Trey's visits were harmful to Mr. Bailey's health and mood. Yes, the elderly man was already bedridden, but he remained cheerful, open to communication, and often met with friends. After Trey's visits, he was an entirely different person. Faded look, grey face, complete apathy. Some time would pass, and the old Mr. Bailey returned, until Trey appeared in his house again. A very strange pattern. Trey. There was something unpleasant about him. A haughty, contemptuous look. He looked through people, considering it beneath his dignity to greet them. A repulsive person, despite his very favourable appearance. Sheila was almost certain that Trey was poisoning his father. She had recently seen such a thing in a TV series where the heir poisoned a relative to inherit their fortune, and Trey, judging by his appearance and the stories of Mr. Bailey and his houseworkers, Trey seemed capable of such a thing. He seemed willing to do anything for money. So Sheila made up her mind. She bought an inexpensive camera, watched a few videos on how to install it, and left the camera in Mr. Bailey's bedroom. Sheila knew that soon his son would come, and she wanted to see for herself what was going on. If her suspicions were confirmed, if Trey was putting something in his father's water or food, she would go to the police. Finally the day came. Trey arrived at his father's house. He walked past Sheila without even a glance. She was used to such dismissive treatment. Soon her suspicions would either be confirmed or disproved. Anything was better than not knowing. Sheila went to the staff room, which was empty. She took out her phone and displayed the picture from Mr. Bailey's bedroom. The quality was excellent. She saw every detail and heard every sound. That was good. "How are you feeling?" Trey asked, sitting down at his father's bedside. "You're looking good." "I'm fine, Trey. How are you?" "Better than ever. Our case, how's it going?" "Father," Trey looked at him reproachfully, "you know it's useless." "But the detectives are still searching." "They are," Trey nodded. "You spend a lot of money on them, but even they think it's a waste of time and finances. That girl, your daughter, she probably didn't even exist. You made her up." Mr. Bailey shook his head and asked Trey to get a photograph of his daughter. Sheila understood nothing. Mr. Bailey had only a son, Trey. What daughter was he talking about? Trey obediently pulled an A4 photo from a folder and handed it to his father. "She exists," Mr. Bailey said, looking fondly at the photo. "She is my daughter. The child of the woman with whom you were cheating on my mother. She's dead. Maybe she was your daughter. Maybe not. Keep searching." "You're insane." Trey looked at his father with anger and hatred. "You won't accept the obvious. I know why you're so eager to find this mythical daughter, who either died as a child or never existed. You're just disappointed in me and hope she'll turn out to be better." Mr. Bailey turned grey and pale. His son's words caused him physical pain. Sheila realised Trey wasn't poisoning his father. He was killing him with words and bad news. Mr. Bailey was looking for his daughter. Trey seemed to be helping, but it wasn't really helping. Father and son talked more. Mr. Bailey promised to transfer a large sum of money to Trey, part for the detectives and part for Trey's efforts. The search for the missing daughter was now Trey's job, for which he received a salary. That's what Sheila understood from their conversation. Trey left. Only then did Sheila enter Mr. Bailey's room. He was either asleep or in a state of forgetfulness. As usual, after Trey's visit, his skin was grey, and there were dark circles under his eyes. Talking to Trey drained him. The guy didn't spare his father's feelings, and seemed to make it more painful. In Mr. Bailey's hands was the picture. Trey had left it or forgotten to take it. The picture was lying face down. Sheila couldn't resist her curiosity. She took it from the sleeping Mr. Bailey, and was amazed. In the picture, she saw a young woman, beautiful and smiling, holding a small child. It was Sheila's mother and herself. The girl felt dizzy and her vision darkened. Sheila didn't dare speak to Mr. Bailey about it for a long time. At first, he felt bad and wasn't ready for such a shock. Then Sheila was simply afraid. Not only was the subject sensitive, but she would have to confess that she had been spying on Mr. Bailey and Trey, eavesdropping on their conversations, and seeing that photograph. She had pried into things that didn't seem to be her business at first. The fact that these affairs turned out to be Sheila's was revealed after her not-so-tactful intrusion. It was an accident. Mr. Bailey was about to be moved to a hospital for an annual full examination. He would be gone for at least a month, so Sheila couldn't postpone an important conversation any longer. Sheila entered the man's room, holding a picture. It had been in her and her mother's family photo album for many years. Sheila remembered the picture well from her childhood. It was fascinating to see her mother so young, and herself so tiny. "Mr. Bailey, I need to have a serious talk with you. Look at this," Sheila said, handing the elderly man the picture. "I know you have one just like it. It's strange and surprising. Please tell me where you got this photo." Mr. Bailey's expression changed. He looked carefully at Sheila's face, as if trying to read something from it. "It can't be. But it was obvious from the beginning. Your looks, could it really be you?" "Explain it to me. I don't understand anything. Did you have a daughter? Where did you get this photo? I have the same picture. This picture was sent to me by the best woman in the world. She was probably the only one I ever really loved. It was a wonderful feeling. But we weren't meant to be together, as it turned out. This is Gina. I told you about her, remember?" Gina. Sheila's mum. She was the very woman Mr. Bailey had once spoken of. He had met her at the factory and had seen her for several months. He finally lost his head over her. He had already made grandiose plans, knew it would not be easy, but was still going to part with Danielle and then propose to the one who made him so happy. But it wasn't meant to be. About a year and a half later, Trey had already been born. He became the centre of the universe for Danielle and for me too. Then this letter arrived with no return address. It contained a photograph, the one you're holding now. Gina and an adorable little girl. She wrote that she'd given birth to my daughter and wanted me to know. She wanted me to know that our love didn't dissolve into nothingness, that it had a continuation, a wonderful child. Gina also wrote that she was married and living in another city with her husband. She asked me not to look for her. The only thing she wanted was for me to know about you, about your existence. Mr. Bailey, of course, tried to find Gina, but she had really left town. Where and with whom she didn't tell anyone. She resigned from her job, took her daughter and left. Mum used to tell me she tried to build a family with one man, and they did leave for a few years. Then Mum broke up with him and we moved back, Sheila said. If I had known that, Mr. Bailey looked at Sheila attentively. If you are Gina's daughter, then she is gone. You told me about your life. I remember everything. Yes, my mum is gone. And I had so much to tell her. Mr. Bailey shook his head sadly, then continued to the story. I wanted to at least meet her before I died and give her support, do something for her. So I hired detectives. I mean, Trey did. I told him everything and put him in charge of the investigation. I couldn't do it on my own. I managed to find out something. Gina did have a daughter, but she was dead. I didn't believe it and the documents looked fake, but someone wanted to cover their tracks. I asked Trey to keep investigating, but it was fruitless. The bad news was getting to me lately. Time was slipping away and the chances of finding my daughter were getting slimmer. But fate took pity. You found me, And Trey? I don't think he was looking. He was just taking the money I gave him for the detectives. I'm not stupid. I know he's afraid of the inheritance. Afraid he'll have to share it with his sister. With you. I don't even know what to say. Sheila's eyes fluttered in confusion. Her mind was reeling from what she had just heard. But somewhere deep inside, she felt warmth. Warmth was spilling over her whole body. She had a father, and such a strong, kind, wise one at that. It's unbelievable. We have so much catching up to do while it's still possible. Mr. Bailey smiled warmly at Sheila. We'll do our best, and Trey, he'll even be pleased later when he realizes everything. Can you imagine? Trey has dreamed of a sister all his life. A sister. When he was little, he asked us to give him a sister. But then he stopped, of course, as he got older. I think Trey will be happy. Mr. Bailey stretched out his hand and squeezed Sheila's palm firmly. The girl smiled. She suddenly felt wings grow behind her back. She was not alone now. She had a family. Floriana was studying another case, contemplating the meaning of human life. Behind every line, she read, lay someone's fate, shattered hopes and universal despair. The young lawyer mentally asked herself for the umpteenth time, why don't people appreciate what they have? Why does love fade so quickly and families fall apart? There was no clear answer to these difficult questions, a fact that upset her deeply. Floriana opened another folder, detailing yet another family's collapse. She had barely skimmed the first paragraph when her office door swung open noisily. Mr. Campbell stood on the threshold. Floriana sprang up reflexively. Mr. Campbell, I haven't finished reviewing all the materials yet. Floriana, why do you always jump up when I appear? We're not in the army. I'm not against discipline, but this is excessive. Floriana knew from experience it was better not to argue with superiors. She slowly lowered herself back into her chair. Mr. Campbell seemed pleased with her compliance. That's better, Floriana. You've been jumping up like a schoolgirl. It's not your first day here. It's time to get used to our company's conditions. They're quite mild, creating a favourable environment for productive work. At least, I'm convinced of this. The chief's smile gave Floriana more confidence. She smiled back. Yes, the conditions here are very comfortable, and I am used to them. It's just that I jump up involuntarily. It's become a reflex. At university, they drilled into us that rules of subordination are a mandatory in any structure, and during our internships, we were constantly on edge. Mr. Campbell lowered his heavy body into a vacant chair. Oh, don't get me started on this subordination nonsense. It was invented by bureaucrats. They need to justify their salaries, so they invent different rules. Of course, I'm for discipline, but everything should be in moderation. His rather lengthy monologue seemed to bore even himself, and he exhaled noisily. A moment later, the man leaned closer to the miniature fan on Floriana's desk. It's sweltering today. I can hardly breathe. All right, Floriana, let's talk business. I have a task of a personal nature for you. The thing is, an acquaintance of mine is going through a divorce. It's a complicated situation, and she needs the support of a good lawyer. The topic is delicate because she's quite well known in business circles and doesn't want publicity about the divorce proceedings. Her husband is a young, overzealous scoundrel, and his insolence knows no bounds. Not only did he ruin the life of a wonderful woman, but he wants to take away part of her property. He's flooded the poor woman with lawsuits and used her money to hire a whole team of lawyers. But she and I have decided on a different tactic, and you're ideally suited to deliver the main blow. Floriana blurted out, Mr. Campbell, but I'm still just... The chief cast a thoughtful glance at his subordinate. "I know you're still learning and haven't handled any difficult cases yet, but you haven't lost a single trial, and that's a critical indicator in our work. In fact, I'm confident you can handle this case as well. Here's her file, and here's my friend's phone number. Set up a meeting and start working on it." The chief left, carefully closing the door. A whirlwind of emotions stirred in the young lawyer's soul. On one hand, she felt proud that Mr. Campbell trusted her. On the other, she feared she might not live up to his expectations. Floriana Polono had been working at the private law firm for less than 3 years, but in that relatively short time she'd seen it all. On her very first day, her boss hadn't bothered with standard questions. He'd merely glanced at her and decisively stated, "You'll be handling divorce cases." Of course, back then, Floriana was taken aback, but she gave a deep nod, signalling her acceptance of the chief's command. She expected further explanations, but Mr. Campbell just stared at her with a dissatisfied look. "If everything's clear, why are we still standing here?" Floriana shifted uncertainly. "But I don't know what to do yet." Mr. Campbell flung his sharply sharpened pencil, spearing it into a pile of papers. This dramatic gesture made a powerful impression on the recent law school graduate. "If you don't know yet, then go study the urgent cases. We don't have time to waste when there's plenty of work to do. We're swamped here, so there's no time for pleasantries. The company's reputation is at stake. You understand, rookie?" Floriana nodded again. She had expected a very different encounter. She was completely bewildered by the behaviour of the man under whose authority she was to work. In despair, she wanted to cry and run away from this office, but Mr. Campbell, noting the girl's expressive face, realised he had gone a bit too far. In a more peaceful tone, he said, "No tears here, please. This isn't the place for the faint-hearted. You'll soon realise that yourself. It's better to get used to the peculiarities of the job from your very first day. And I advise you to pay less attention to my moods." Mr. Campbell winked at the new girl. "Sometimes I can be worse than any fairy tale villain, but I remain kind at heart." Very soon, Floriana realised that Mr. Campbell was indeed the kindest person. He treated his subordinates in a fatherly way, for which he was loved and greatly respected by the team. And now, after the boss had left, Floriana looked at her watch and realised that her lunch had already started. The problem was that she had arranged to meet her fiancé during that time. She called him, and with tenderness in her voice whispered, "David, my boss held me back. I completely forgot about you." Without waiting for words of reproach from her fiancé, she quickly added, "Honey, please don't be angry." There was a hearty laugh, and then the voice that made the girl's heart race said, "Miss Polono, you know how to sweet talk and divert attention. Anyway, I'm pleased to know that you still remember your fiancé from time to time. Honey, I'd still like to see you, so I'm waiting for you in our usual spot at the park. Remember, you only have 10 minutes to get ready. Try not to disappoint me this time." Floriana guessed that David was alluding to a recent incident that happened while meeting his parents. David's parents had greeted their future daughter-in-law with joyful exclamations. "Floriana, we're so happy that our son has finally decided to say goodbye to bachelor life," his father said. "You're so pretty, a worthy companion for our David," his mother added. Floriana was a little embarrassed by the overt flattery, but didn't show it. She had no idea what else lay ahead of her. When everyone sat down at the richly laid table, the questions began. In their unrestrained curiosity, David's parents went so far as to ask about her father's earnings. They were most interested in property matters, and when Floriana told them the tragic story of her mother's death, they didn't even express basic sympathy. David's father merely asked, "I suppose your mother left you a substantial inheritance?" This question angered the girl, and she replied rather rudely, "Is money really the most important thing to you?" The tone of the future daughter-in-law displeased the man. He responded with an obvious challenge. "It's easy for you to discuss the importance of money when you have an all-powerful daddy behind you. But our son has no such reliable support. We're simple village workers. We value every hard-earned penny, while your daddy's money seems to come easily for him."
Floriana couldn't help herself. "My dad stands at the operating table 24 hours a day to earn a decent salary. But his main goal isn't money, it's saving human lives. By the way, he also grew up in a village and then went to study. What stopped you from doing the same?" David realized that the argument had gone too far, but he didn't know how to defuse the situation. Luckily, his mother helped establish peace at the table by scolding the disputants.
"What's the use of stirring up trouble? Floriana is right. Not everything in the world is decided by money. There are more important things."
The meal continued peacefully, but Floriana was left with an unpleasant feeling. She refused to spend the night at their house, citing urgent work. However, David didn't want to let her go.
"Where are you going at night? Stay, and don't take offence at my father. He's old school, so he's used to thinking that way."
"I'm not offended by your father. What surprises me is that you didn't say a word in my and my father's defence."
David laughed hoarsely. "Floriana, you're the lawyer. It's not for me to compete with you."
These words, caressing her ear and heart, relieved the girl's heart a little, but she didn't change her mind. Getting behind the wheel of the car her father had given her for successfully graduating from law school, she drove off to the city. She had expected David to offer to escort her, but he didn't. He said goodbye half-heartedly and headed home. The girl felt a little bitter, but tried to console herself. David hasn't seen his parents in a long time, so it's understandable that he wants to be with them longer. Besides, he doesn't have to cater to my every whim. After all, it's my own fault that the conversation didn't go well. I could have kept quiet, if only honouring his father. After the unsuccessful first visit, she accompanied David to his parents' house several times. They no longer bombarded her with questions, but instead emphasized their joy that their son had chosen such a wonderful girl. Floriana never lacked admirers. From early childhood she was surrounded by male attention. In kindergarten, boys eagerly fulfilled the whims of the capricious little girl. Later, when Floriana was in first grade, 2 young suitors even fought over her. Surprisingly, the teacher scolded her rather than the boys. "Floriana, I consider you the instigator of this fight. If you've decided to be friends with someone, choose one. Don't flirt with both at once." The girl disagreed with the teacher. With a sly face and a touch of insolence, she said, "What if I want to be friends with all the boys at once?" The teacher, unable to answer the first grader's question, became flustered and changed the subject. Later, she expressed her concerns to the girl's father. "Dr. Polono, please don't misunderstand, but your daughter is behaving inappropriately with boys." The man was so surprised he couldn't hold back his exclamation. "What do you mean, inappropriately? How am I supposed to interpret that?" Realizing her poor choice of words, the teacher tried to salvage the situation. "I'm sorry, I didn't express myself well. You see, your daughter is clearly a leader, and all the boys are drawn to her." Anthony Polono expressed surprise again. "I don't see anything wrong with that." The teacher became even more confused. "Indeed, there's nothing wrong with your girl having leadership qualities, but she also has a striking appearance, so our boys are eager to win her favour." The man laughed. "Oh, is that what you mean? But it's a natural process. Think back to your childhood. I, personally, tried to court all the girls while I was still in kindergarten. In my opinion, there's nothing wrong with such relationships." But the teacher persisted. "I entirely agree with you. Friendship is beneficial in all its forms, but it's impossible to be friends with everyone simultaneously. Floriana first promised Victor that she would be his friend. Then she made the same promise to Paul. As a result, the boys fought. And you think my daughter is to blame for this? Of course. Your Floriana provoked the boys to sort out their relationship with their fists. First, she turned one's head, then the other's. Please influence your daughter.
Mrs. Morgan exclaimed. But Mr. Polono only grinned. How can I influence her? Forbid her to socialise with her classmates? Do you think that's the right approach? Finding no understanding with the girl's father, Mrs. Morgan took offence at him, but began to take out her displeasure on the little girl. It escalated to the point where, in a fit of uncontrollable anger, the teacher humiliated Floriana in front of the entire class. Polono, nothing good will come of upstarts like you. You'll grow up and end up in the gutter. The first-grade girls didn't understand the true meaning of this expression, but they all giggled, pointing their fingers at Floriana. Paul, whom she had rejected, tried the hardest. Floriana ran out of the classroom and hid under the stairs, so no one could see her crying. When Dr. Polono came to school to pick up his little daughter, Mrs. Morgan was surprised. Isn't Floriana at home? If she were at home, I wouldn't have come for her. Where is my daughter? The exasperated father demanded an answer, and the teacher was at a loss for words. Stammering, she began to explain confusingly. You see, Dr. Polono, your girl is sometimes uncontrollable. Today we had an incident. Floriana threw a tantrum during class and then ran out of the classroom. I thought she'd gone home. Dr. Polono was furious. He hissed angrily. Mrs. Morgan, pray to God that nothing happens to my child. An elderly cleaning lady helped find the missing child. As teachers and high school students began to search the building and the surrounding area, the woman asked, Why are you all in such a fuss? One of the teachers thought to ask her, Have you seen a first grader? A little blonde girl with pigtails? The elderly woman put on an important face. Every other girl here has pigtails, but there's one hiding under the stairs. Dr. Polono rushed to the place the cleaning lady was pointing to, and there he found his daughter, sleeping on dusty things. Mrs. Morgan, frightened out of her wits, said confusedly, Well, nothing terrible has happened. The girl has been found, and you shouldn't have panicked. Dr. Polono hissed threateningly, We'll sort this out yet. I promise you that I will not let this outrageous affair slide. Where has it been seen that first-grade girls run away from lessons? Mrs. Morgan was trembling like a leaf on the wind, but she didn't want to admit her guilt. How can I keep track of them all? I'm alone, and I have 24 of them. Dr. Polono was merciless to the teacher when he pronounced his verdict. You must have made a mistake in your choice of profession. It's dangerous to entrust children to you. Dr. Polono did not scold his daughter for her rash act, but tried to find out what prompted her to run away from the lesson. Floriana immediately confessed. Mrs. Morgan said that bad words about me. Everyone began to laugh at me and I took offence, especially at Paul, and it's a good thing I didn't become friends with him. Dr. Polono was shocked at what he heard from his daughter. The next morning, he went straight to the school principal and demanded action against the teacher, who allowed herself such statements in the presence of children. The principal listened to the outraged father and sighed heavily. Dear Dr. Polono, I understand you perfectly well, but I can't do anything. There's a chronic shortage of staff, especially in elementary school. No one wants to work with kids. Dr. Polono stared at the principal. So you won't take any measures? The principal waved his hands. Alas, the only thing I can do in this situation is to give Mrs. Morgan a stern warning. If I apply more radical measures, she'll wave goodbye to us. That is, she'll go to another school, where she'll be welcomed with open arms. Dr. Polono hadn't expected such a turn. He asked confusedly, What am I to do? Put up with the lawlessness that reigns in your school? The principal tried to smile. Why so unflattering about our institution? We do our best to educate future citizens. But if you're personally not satisfied with our school, you can transfer your daughter to another one. As for me, I can offer only this solution. Transfer the girl to a parallel class. Dr. Polono agreed. Floriana learned about her father's conversation with the principal a little later when they went to visit her grandparents, and she accidentally overheard adults talking.
Having learned about the teacher's outrageous act, the grandmother began to rant.
What on earth is going on? This is a real outrage. In our time, the teacher was a role model, a paragon of decency. And now what? The principal told you right, son. You should transfer to another school.
Mum, I told the principal, and I'll repeat it to you. I'm not going to raise my daughter in greenhouse conditions. I want her to be prepared for any hardship in life. The grandmother said judgmentally, So you want to throw her right into the water? If she doesn't swim, let her drown? Anthony grumbled unhappily. Mum, that's not an excellent comparison. A few seconds later he added, You know very well that Floriana is the most precious thing I have. It was this phrase, or rather the tone with which it was uttered, that turned everything over in the little girl's soul. She vowed that she would never again upset her father. That day, Floriana Polono decided that she would not get involved with boys. True, she soon forgot the last promise, but the girl became more careful about choosing friends. After David's call, Floriana didn't hesitate long and immediately went to meet him. She literally ran to the park where her fiancé was waiting for her. Her high heels hindered this mode of travel, and several times the girl risked falling. David noticed her from afar and waved in greeting. He was sitting on a park bench with a smile, watching his bride. When Floriana plopped down beside him, breathless, David laughed. Yes, you obviously have problems with sprinting. After the wedding, I'll have to take care of your physical training. The girl still hadn't caught her breath after running, so she didn't answer right away. Are you kidding at me? The young man drew her to himself and gently kissed her forehead. What do you mean? Do I look like an evil torturer? It was just very amusing to watch you run. And if I had crashed, would it have looked funny too? Floriana's voice sounded resentful, and David made a funny grimace. Floriana, don't take offence at such trifles. Perhaps I made a bad joke. Forgive this rascal, he won't do it again, the young man said, making a funny face at her. David knew well what annoyed and what made his future spouse happy. After all, they had been dating for 2 years, a considerable period by today's standards. Despite his education in construction field, he was an excellent physiognomist. From a person's facial expressions and gestures, David could unmistakably determine their mood. This ability was very helpful in working with clients. If he noticed that someone was dissatisfied, he would let his natural charm take over. The young man also had no misfires with women. He tried to surround each girl or woman with attention and care, and it worked without fail. But David quickly tired of each new romance and parted with his girlfriends without regret. His parents scolded their son for frivolity, his father being especially diligent in this. David, you'll waste your whole life like this. I don't understand what you're so obsessed about. Are you constantly looking for a princess? Such reproaches made the young man laugh. What if I'm lucky and some princess really falls in love with me? You're a troublemaker, David, living in dreams. You're a countryman yourself, and you should look for a girl from your own circle to marry. It's a pity it didn't work out with Laurie. She would have made a good wife. The mention of his former lover caused both longing and irritation. David made incredible efforts to forget about her, and his efforts were not in vain. The more time passed, the more the past faded. Meeting Floriana proved that dreaming wasn't harmful. Although their acquaintance occurred under rather strange circumstances, David immediately realized that this girl was sent to him by fate. After serving in the army, he returned to his native village full of hope, but for several months he couldn't find a decent job. His parents patiently tolerated his chronic dependency, trying to help him with advice, and more often with reproaches. David, stop fooling around. How long do you intend to chill out? His father asked from time to time. Dad, you can see that I'm looking for a job. Where are you looking? At home, lying on the couch? Dad, why start an empty conversation on this subject when you know very well what kind of job situation we're in? You're not looking hard enough.
We have a shortage of people on the farm, and you'd be surely hired in workshops or construction sites. Did you study for nothing? Do you want me to get you a job at the fuel depot?" Mother immediately joined the conversation, offering her own employment options. "We also need responsible people without bad habits. The pay is good and the work isn't hard because everything is mechanized." Usually at this point, a dispute would break out between his parents, which allowed David to sneak out of the house. He didn't support either of the opposing sides because one day he realized that he didn't want to spend his life in the village. However, this realization didn't come immediately. Before the army and shortly after his service, he didn't consider village life so flawed. David even planned to settle down in his native land and have many children. After all, back in school, he had fallen in love with a girl whom he long considered the standard of beauty. Laurie Walsh reciprocated his love. She wrote him tender letters when he was in the army. David got used to the idea that he should marry her. But a tragedy befell Laurie that ruined all the young man's plans. The accident occurred just during his job search period, and it was this circumstance that made David reconsider his intentions. Without informing his parents, he simply ran away from home, taking a little money from the family piggy bank. His mother was aghast when he called 2 days later to let her know he was okay.
"David, your father and I almost went crazy. We didn't know what to think. Is that the way to treat your parents? Was it so hard to warn us?"
The grown son began to ineptly justify himself. "Mum, I'll return the money as soon as I get my first paycheck. I'll send it to you by transfer or bring it myself." But Nina impatiently interrupted her son.
"What does money have to do with it? You did something terrible, and that's a more important thing than money."
When David heard his mother's sobs over the phone, he physically felt how her tears echoed with pain in his heart.
"Mum, please don't cry. Believe me, I didn't mean to hurt you. Everything just happened spontaneously, as if someone from above told me to go to the city, that my destiny was there."
This confession calmed his mother a little.
"Maybe it's true. Maybe you'll find a good job in the city, and God willing, you'll meet a nice girl."
David felt that she had something else to say, and he was not mistaken. With a heavy sigh, the woman said, "I didn't want to tell you, but Laurie left too. Her father took her away. They're very upset with us. Maybe it's for the best that he did." David agreed. "You're right, Mum. It's better for everyone. Let them judge me, call me a coward, but I'm not ready for such a serious test." The mother said nothing, but from her restless breathing, the son realized that she fully supported him. David's job search was lucky. Almost without leaving the station, he found a suitable position in a pizzeria. The young man went into the establishment just to have a snack, but right at the entrance, his gaze fell on a vacancy announcement. He asked out of curiosity, "How long have you had a vacancy for a courier?" The girl grinned. "Since this morning. A few people have already applied, but the owner didn't like them." David asked with a chuckle, "Maybe I'd be more to your master's liking?" The girl held her gaze on him. "Quite possibly. He is a bore, but he pays well. If you don't have a weakness for drink and are honest about your duties, you should give it a try." Without waiting for David's answer, the girl called out, "Mr. Hasley, there's another interested candidate." Before David could blink, a short man in a chef's hat appeared. He looked at David for a long time, then began to study his documents with the same intensity. Finally, he said, "Well, young man, let's see what you're capable of. If you pass the probationary period, I'll keep you. I can't promise much, but you won't be disappointed." Despite its modest size, the pizzeria was popular with the townspeople. It was especially crowded at lunchtime, but some pizza lovers ordered late in the evening and even at night. David travelled around the city in the owner's car, delivering orders, often forgetting to eat. He frequently had to work overtime, but never once expressed dissatisfaction. The owner really paid well, and the guy soon managed to get a decent apartment in a house not far from his workplace. One summer evening, Mr. Hasley asked him to stay a little longer. "David, we have a real mess today. You could say a disaster. Andy suddenly fell ill and there are plenty of orders. Help me out." Despite his exhaustion, David cheerfully declared, "Mr. Hasley, I'm at your complete disposal. Command me." The owner immediately gave him a list of orders and said, "David, just try to meet the delivery times. There are people on this list that I don't want to upset." The young man wasn't surprised by the request but asked, "So tell me, whom to serve first?" "You'll go to this address first. Dr. Kevin Burnham is our regular customer and my saviour. A few years ago I was in a car accident. I was badly injured and thought I'd never walk again. That probably would have happened if I hadn't been lucky enough to get to Dr. Burnham. He's a God-given doctor, a real talent, even though he's very young. He's a little older than you." David was very impressed by the story and eager to see the wizard doctor. But when he arrived at the address and rang the doorbell, a girl suddenly ran out of the apartment, followed by a young man in a fancy outfit. David guessed that he was an accidental witness to a love drama. This guess was confirmed by the words the young man called after the girl. "Floriana, wait! You misunderstood everything. I'm ready to wait for you, even for ages." The girl shouted back, "Kevin, please don't make such sacrifices. Why can't you realize that I just don't love you?" The couple argued for a minute or two on the floor below, and David patiently waited for the denouement. Finally, a door slammed loudly, and soon the young doctor returned. From his upset face, David realized that this evening had clearly not gone well for him. But the courier's job didn't include consoling customers, so he said the catchphrase, "There is your pizza, and we're glad you don't change your taste preferences." The young man stared blankly at David, then said sluggishly, "Oh yes, I'd forgotten I ordered pizza. Don't need it now, though." Afraid that the upset doctor might refuse the order, he hastily handed him 2 boxes. The doctor immediately took out his wallet and paid. The next moment, the apartment door slammed, so David didn't have time to deliver the final phrase. Since he had neither time nor desire to dwell on the doctor's problems, David quickly went down to the first floor and headed for the car. He suddenly stopped short, however, because near the car stood the same girl who had caused the good doctor such suffering. Noticing the courier's confusion, the stranger asked, "Would you give me a lift to the city centre? I don't have my car today." Naturally, David couldn't refuse the girl at such a late hour, but he warned her, "I'll take you all the way home, but on the way I have to stop at 4 addresses." The girl smiled. "I'm in no hurry. I'm even interested in learning the intricacies of courier work." Her soft voice, especially her smile, made the strongest impression on David. He had never experienced such feelings when meeting girls before. At first he was even a little confused. But the girl was the first to start a conversation. She introduced herself and mentioned that she worked at a law firm. Then she began to ask about his work. Floriana behaved casually, as if they had known each other for years. David quickly forgot about his initial awkwardness. He quipped, told jokes, and shared funny stories from his life as a courier. That night changed everything in David's life. The next morning, he realized that Floriana was sent to him by fate. Terribly nervous, he called the girl and asked her on a date. She accepted. Pleasant memories flashed in David's head for a brief moment as he watched Floriana, but all extraneous thoughts receded when she settled down next to him. Floriana looked guiltily at her fiancé. "David, sorry I'm late. The boss gave me a new case, so I had to stay a bit longer." The young man asked in an indifferent tone, "And what is it?" The girl began to apologize again. "David, I can't disclose confidential information." The young man remarked with resentment in his voice, "Oh yes, I forgot that we're birds of a different feather. I'm just a delivery boy, a pizza delivery boy, and you're an important person." A nervous twitch crossed the girl's face. "David, why are you saying this? You know very well that, for me, it's the person that matters, not their status or wealth." The guy averted his eyes. "I'm sorry. I've been irritable lately. It's probably because of my father's illness." Floriana asked anxiously, "What's wrong with him? Is it serious?"
David waved his hand glumly. It couldn't be more serious. I'm not good with medical terms, but there's something wrong with his back. He can't bend or straighten up. My mother is in a complete panic because my father is the mainstay of the house and I can't quit my job to help them. That's the situation, Floriana. Why didn't you tell me before? Or did you forget that your future father-in-law is a doctor? The young man lowered his gaze. No, I haven't forgotten, but it's awkward somehow. Your father doesn't take too kindly to me as it is. I don't want to annoy him with requests. The girl looked affectionately at her fiancé. David, please don't fill your head with ridiculous ideas. My father is a very decent man and an excellent doctor. It wouldn't cost him anything to arrange a consultation for your father. We just need to arrange it in advance and choose a convenient time for the visit. David perked up. You think it's worth asking him? Floriana laughed. I'll talk to Dad today and call you tomorrow. The young man cheered up. Floriana, you're a real miracle. How lucky I was to have met you that night. I can't imagine what would have happened if you had stayed with that young doctor. In a burst of emotion, David embraced Floriana, but she quickly freed herself from his embrace. Don't be so harsh, David. Kevin is a good person. He had been courting me for a long time, but you can't command your heart, can you? David asked defiantly, You pity that loser? Well, know that I don't like it. The girl didn't answer his question, but her tone changed as she remarked, David, you could have been in Kevin's place. Let's not talk about this any more. I don't like this kind of talk. The girl stood up abruptly. That's it, I'll have to go to work. I'll call you tomorrow. David got up and together with his fiancée headed for the exit of the park. He wanted to kiss the girl goodbye, but she dodged. There are many strangers here, and I don't like to display my feelings in public. We're almost husband and wife. What is there to be shy about? And in general, you're behaving very strangely, he said unhappily. Floriana was surprised. What's strange about my behaviour? At least the fact you have a wedding coming up. And you're thinking about completely unrelated things. Normal brides share their dress and hairstyle, and you... The girl interrupted the groom mid-sentence. David, I'm not like the others. It's a pity you still haven't realised it. Floriana hurriedly walked away, leaving the groom alone with his thoughts. David watched the girl for a long time, and only when she disappeared he thought, My princess is not as simple as she seems. For the first time in almost 2 years, David doubted the correctness of his choice of life partner. He diligently pushed away the negative thoughts, reassuring himself that marriage with Floriana, if not making him happy, would at least allow him to live comfortably without much strain. Of course, Floriana had no idea what her future husband was thinking at these moments. After learning about David's father's illness, she began to think hard about how to help her future relative. These worries didn't leave her head, even as she plunged headfirst into the new case her boss had assigned her. Later that evening, opening her father's apartment door, Floriana sniffed the air. Wow, is my daddy cooking something delicious? Anthony Polono called out from the kitchen. You guessed it, daughter. My sister sent me a recipe for a simple and hearty dish this morning. So, I decided to experiment a little at the stove. Floriana kicked off her uncomfortable heels and slipped her feet into soft slippers with pleasure. She walked into the kitchen and hugged her father. Dad, you have no idea how much I love you. Anthony glanced at his daughter. I adore you too, but you don't look well today. Come, wash your hands and sit at the table. In 2 minutes we can have our meal. In the small Polono family there was a rule. No talk about business during meals. Dr. Polono himself strictly observed this rule. When dinner was finished, he said with a smile, That's it, my daughter. Now, it's your turn. I cooked dinner, so you wash the dishes. Floriana was childishly embarrassed. Dad, you know how to spoil the mood. You know very well that I can't stand washing dishes. Anthony was surprised. What's this now? You're getting married, aren't you? Do you really expect your husband to do your dishes, laundry, and cleaning for you?" A blush broke out on the girl's cheeks. "Dad, I did get the impression you're not happy that I'm getting married. Of course, I guess you don't like David, but—" Anthony hastily interrupted his daughter. "The main thing is that you like him. But that's not the point. I hate to tell you this, but I'm more experienced in life. Perhaps I'm wrong, but your David reminds me of a gold digger." Floriana exclaimed. "Dad!" But Anthony said very calmly, "Forgive my frankness, daughter, but I've said what I think. I'll be glad if my opinion turns out to be wrong." His daughter's eyebrows furrowed. "There, you've ruined everything. Now I don't know if I should ask you." The smile lit up on the man's face again. "Daughter, ask me anything you want." Floriana told him briefly about David's father's illness. As she spoke, the expression on her father's face changed from amused to worried. "Why didn't they catch it sooner? Tell your David to bring his father to our clinic. I'll have Dr. Burnham take a look at him." Floriana was surprised. "But he has a different speciality." Anthony grinned. "Wow, another medical expert. For your information, Dr. Burnham is a highly specialized specialist. You'll be hard-pressed to find such doctors. In short, first we'll see what's going on, and then we'll decide on the treatment for our future relative. In the meantime, let our patient apply this marvelous ointment to his back. This ointment is excellent for back stiffness and pain." After a brief search at the first aid kit, Anthony took out a package of ointment and handed it to his daughter. Let David bring the medicine to his father, and he should not postpone with his consultation. The girl looked anxiously into her father's eyes. "Dad, do you think it's appropriate?" "What exactly?" "Well, asking Kevin." Dr. Polono patted his daughter on the shoulder. "Daughter, a doctor must be true to his oath and do his duty in any situation. Kevin is a consummate professional. For him, his patient's life is paramount, and everything else is secondary." After the conversation with his daughter, Anthony couldn't sleep for a long time. He lay awake, pondering the intricacies of his fate. How many times had it thrown serious trials his way? Was he again waiting for another test of strength? Unfortunately, he didn't know the answer to this question yet. The man rolled over on his side, hoping the change of position would help him sleep. But restless thoughts spun in his head like a merry-go-round that couldn't be stopped. Realizing that this night would be sleepless, Anthony no longer tried to force himself to sleep. He began to recall the most remarkable events of his life. Anthony discovered his vocation. Back in elementary school, he couldn't pass by an abandoned cat or dog without trying to treat wounded animals. To his parents, this hobby seemed strange, so his mother constantly scolded him. "Anthony, why are you dragging everyone into the house? Didn't they tell you at school that animals transmit all sorts of diseases?" The boy was indignant at this accusation. "Mum, do you think if they're sick they should be thrown out? But then they'll die, and that's inhumane." His mother grumbled, but didn't dare to throw out the animals her son had temporarily taken in. His father never scolded his offspring. He supported his acts of mercy. "Anthony, listen to your mum. Less and do as your heart says. Animals can't stand up for themselves, so you have to help them. God willing, you'll grow up and become a veterinarian." At first, Anthony wanted to devote himself to this profession, but then he realized he had to save people. This realization of his destiny came to him in 7th grade. Since his knowledge in some subjects was clearly lacking, he had to study hard. The village boy's diligence paid off, and he finished school with only 2 Bs. Anthony resolutely declared to his parents, "I will go to the capital. I want to become a famous doctor." His mother laughed in response to such a bold statement. "Son, wake up. You must be from a rich family to afford to study medicine in the capital. And who are you, a simple country boy? Go to veterinary school. You won't go wrong." As always, his father stood up for his son. "Mother, don't speak about what you don't know. Everything can be achieved if you have a goal and the strength for it. Who knows? Maybe our Anthony will become a doctor. Don't stand in his way."
The father's word was final in their family, so the mother never raised this topic again. Anthony entered medical school on his first attempt. Throughout his student years, he focused solely on his studies and didn't get distracted by entertainment. His classmates used to tease him, "Anthony, don't put too much weight on the granite of science or you'll be left without teeth, and girls won't love you." But Anthony wasn't offended by such taunts and usually replied, "All in good time. I'll get my diploma, then I'll take a month off to make up for lost opportunities." But the implementation of this bold plan was prevented by one circumstance. In his final year, Anthony was offered a position in the Department of Military Surgery. He thought about it overnight and agreed in the morning. For several years, Dr. Polono performed his medical duty in various conflict zones. In one of these places, he met Bella, a young nurse at a military hospital. Their romance developed according to the classic scenario, and the couple was in no hurry to tie the knot. But one day, an incident occurred that prompted the lovers to hasten their marriage. The medical facility where they saved the lives of both military personnel and civilians was attacked one night by a gang. By some miracle, there were no casualties. When help arrived and the bandits were neutralized, Bella took a long time to recover. She was crying and, with a tremor in her voice, babbled, "That's it, Anthony, I can't go on. I really want to live. I want a normal family and children. It's good that my contract is about to expire." Anthony shared similar feelings, but felt he had no moral right to show weakness in front of his beloved. Soon, he proposed to Bella. After arduously negotiating a week's leave from his superiors, Dr. Polono travelled with his bride to the homeland. They signed their marriage certificate at the registry office. Despite its modesty, the ceremony didn't diminish the newlyweds' happiness. Anthony promised his young wife, "Bella, I swear every day of our life together will be as joyous as today." Anthony Polono would likely have kept his promise if not for fate's intervention. The couple decided to postpone having children until Anthony completed his service. Upon returning home, Bella easily found work and simultaneously searched for a position for her husband. She shared the good news over the phone. "Anthony, don't dawdle. You can't imagine how hard I had to persuade the chief to hold the surgeon's position. He only agreed because of your field experience." After 2 long years apart, the couple finally settled into domestic life. Naturally, their primary concern, starting a family, topped their list of priorities. One evening, Bella whispered in her husband's ear, "Anthony, we're having a baby. I saw the doctor today. I'm already 5 weeks along." From that day, Anthony began meticulously monitoring his wife's health. He shielded her from strain and regulated the expectant mother's daily routine. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and the couple learned they were having a girl. Anthony recalled that summer day minute by minute. He and Bella had planned to shop for maternity clothes, but as luck would have it, Anthony was urgently called to the hospital. Reluctant to disappoint his wife, he suggested, "Bella, could you please wait for me? I'll try to be quick." The woman laughed. "Ha! Quick in surgery? You'll be lucky to be back by midnight." Confused, the man asked, "So what should we do?" Bella clung to her husband, and at that moment, their baby girl stirred in her belly. Bella laughed heartily. "Our daughter has a say too." Anthony Polono knelt and pressed his ear to his wife's belly. "But I can't hear what she's saying." "I can. Our daughter says you should go to work, and we'll go shopping ourselves. I'll take Sarah and her daughter with me. She needs to shop too." Anthony knew his wife's friend well, a woman abandoned by her husband with a small child. The unfortunate woman struggled to balance her daughter and work. Bella discussed her friend's plight almost every evening, which was beginning to wear on Anthony. One day he even asked, "Bella, don't we have anything else to talk about? I understand and sympathize with Sarah, but we have our own concerns. Besides, doesn't she have relatives who could help?" Bella then got angry with him and threw a short, "She has no one. Sarah grew up in a troubled family and wants nothing to do with her relatives. And she has no husband." Anthony felt ashamed of his remarks and refrained from making similar remarks thereafter. On that fateful day, the man helped his wife to get into the cab and headed to the hospital, where a patient awaited him. As his wife had predicted, it was a complex case, and he operated for nearly 6 hours. However, when a tired but satisfied doctor left the operating room, he noticed his colleagues giving him strange looks. He asked the nurse on duty in a weak voice, "Can you explain these looks and sighs? What's wrong?" The nurse made a choking sound and burst into tears.
"Dr. Polono, your wife, she's here."
He rushed toward the operating room, but his colleagues blocked him. "Dr. Polono, you'd better not see her yet." He barely remembers what happened next. Everything around him became a blur of talking shadows, their words incomprehensible. Dr. Polono shouted, demanding to see his wife. He thought he heard Bella calling him. One of the young surgeons led him straight to the freight elevator, where 2 sheet-covered bodies lay on a gurney in a small hallway. At that moment, the terrible truth dawned on him. The young intern explained sorrowfully, "Your wife and her friend were both in the right side of the car when a minibus with 40 brakes hit the cab." Dr. Polono asked in a hollow voice. "And the cab driver?" The young intern replied, "Concussion and several fractures. There was a child in the car, a girl. She was sitting on the left side behind the driver. That's what saved her." "Where is she?" The young doctor, surprised by the question, answered, "The nurses took her to our pediatric department. It's a miracle she only has some scratches. The child welfare authorities should come for her soon." Dr. Polono strode quickly toward the pediatric department. He sat down beside the little girl and held out his hand to her. "Well, Floriana, we're left alone. What shall we do?" The little girl stretched out her hand to him. Dr. Polono pressed her to his chest and whispered, "Don't be afraid of anything. We're destined to be together now." Outside the window, dawn was breaking. Anthony jumped out of bed cheerfully. "Well then, I'll sleep later." He headed for the kitchen, glancing into his daughter's room on the way. Floriana was sound asleep, a blissful smile on her face. The man whispered, "You should be happy for everyone, for Bella, Sarah, and my unborn daughter. I'll do everything so nothing interferes with your happiness." Floriana opened her eyes for a moment. "Dad, is it time to get up?" He quickly replied, "Sleep a little longer. I'll make breakfast." Anthony didn't tell his daughter the whole truth, believing the time for confession hadn't come yet. While preparing breakfast, he decided that Floriana should know everything before her wedding. But the morning began with a small problem. Floriana, as promised, called David. She thought he'd be happy to hear that her father was going to personally take care of his father's treatment, but instead of gratitude, she heard annoyance. "Floriana, it's not a good time. I can't today. I have a full day's work, and tomorrow too. It's a complete emergency here." The girl was surprised. "David, is it so difficult to ask for leave? It's about your father's health, isn't it?" For about half a minute, only David's noisy breathing was heard. After a long pause, he said, "I understand everything, but I can't risk my job because of my father. If my boss throws me out, where else will I find such a cushy position?" The girl was at a loss. Suddenly, David exclaimed, "Floriana, could you go to my parents after your work? I'll be truly grateful if you help me out." The girl had other plans for the evening, but couldn't refuse the man who was soon to become her husband. Without enthusiasm, she said, "All right, David, I'll check on your parents and give them the ointment." David rejoiced at the quick resolution of the problem. "Then you could give my father a lift to town on your way back as well. Why waste time? Let him spend the night at your place. I think your father won't mind." Floriana was accustomed to coordinating with her father everything concerning their joint household, so she answered uncertainly, "Yes, of course he won't mind." The workday flew by instantly. Floriana managed to unearth ironclad evidence against the ex-husband of the new client, and she was pleased with the results of her efforts. So her father wouldn't worry. She called him. "Dad, I'll be late tonight. I'm visiting David's parents."
Can't he do it himself? Floriana realised from her father's voice that he wasn't happy about that news. She herself didn't like that David had pushed the care of his parent onto her either, and all the way to the village she pondered her situation. At some point, a treacherous thought visited her. Didn't I rush into this marriage? She diligently chased the thought away, but it kept returning. It was already dark when the familiar outlines of the village where David's parents lived appeared in the distance. But the road to the village was so broken that Floriana had to drive at minimum speed, further complicated by the dim street lighting. The girl tried to find the right house from memory, but it was difficult to navigate in almost complete darkness. She got out of the car and walked down the street towards a house with lit windows. Soon the girl heard voices that sounded familiar to her. "Oh, I'm at my destination." Floriana quickened her pace. She walked into the yard and froze, realizing she had made a mistake with the house. The girl was about to turn around when she heard voices again from the open window. She realized she had accidentally found herself in the yard of David's parents' neighbours. The Taylors were talking loudly, but the strangest thing was that they were discussing the Baileys. It was the surname that made Floriana listen breathlessly to the conversation. Mrs. Taylor was doing most of the talking, with Mr. Taylor only occasionally making short remarks. Apparently, the conversation had started not long ago, so Floriana caught its essence. "You can't believe people like that. We live not knowing there are such scoundrels around us," Mrs. Taylor said to her husband. "Don't frown. You know what I'm saying about the Baileys. They pretend to be decent, especially Nina, but the other day she boasted to the woman that her son seduced a city fool whose father is a big shot with lots of money." "Why are you going around the village gathering gossip?" Mr. Taylor's judgmental voice was heard. "What gossip? I heard it with my own ears." Nina bragging about her son's exploits. The wife objected. She had better explain how her David got Laurie pregnant and then abandoned her. "Yes, he did wrong. The girl waited for him while he was in the army, and he left her in a difficult moment." Floriana felt that she was short of air. A terrible thought burned in Floriana's mind. David is not who he says he is. No, David couldn't have done that. Maybe the reason for the breakup was different. But her inner voice immediately snidely remarked, "Then why didn't he tell you that he had had a pregnant girlfriend?" The emotions were so strong that Floriana instinctively took a step to the side, stumbled, and a sharp pain pierced her ankle. She screamed. From the window she heard, "Thomas, look who's walking under our windows." The landlord jumped out of the house shouting, "Who's there?" Limping on one leg, Floriana emerged from the shade of the trees. "Mr. Taylor, don't be frightened. It's Floriana. I'm a little lost." The man took a closer look at the uninvited guest. "Helen, it's the neighbour's daughter-in-law. She's wandered into our yard." The hosts cordially brought the night guest in, and Mrs. Taylor told her in detail how David had treated his ex-girlfriend. Laurie worked at the post office and rode her bicycle around the villages to keep up with deliveries. Sometimes she delivered correspondence until late at night. Our roads are treacherous, with ravines, quarries and other obstacles. Once, Laurie was unlucky. She fell off a cliff while taking a shortcut, breaking both her legs and her spine. Poor Laurie's father thought the girl wouldn't survive, but she did. However, she remained disabled. Floriana was anxious to know what part David had played in this story. Mrs. Taylor was reluctant to continue. "I don't want to badmouth David, but right after Laurie's accident he went to the city. Our villagers condemned him, and Nina defended her son, saying she didn't raise her son to take care of a disabled person. Then it became known that Laurie was pregnant when the accident happened to her." Excitement dried Floriana's mouth, and she asked the landlady for water. Mrs. Taylor gave her a full mug. "Didn't David tell you anything about Laurie?" The girl shook her head. "No, this is the first time I've heard the story, and it's good that I did. Tell me, where is Laurie now?"
This time it was Mr. Taylor who spoke up. "They're nearby in a neighbouring village. Carl, her father, went straight to his sister's place. She has a big house. Sometimes he comes here to check on this house." Floriana thanked her hosts and headed for the exit. Mrs. Taylor ran after her. "Where are you going at night? You should spend the night here." The girl grinned bitterly. "Thanks for the invitation, but I have to go." She took out a packet of ointment from her purse. "Mrs. Taylor, could you give this to David's father? He has back trouble, and this ointment is very effective." The woman began to examine the packaging. "All right, I'll pass it on in the morning. But why don't you make your future relatives happy yourself?" Floriana waved her hand dismissively. "I don't feel like it, and it's late." More than anything, she wanted to cry on her father's reliable shoulder, but Floriana realized she shouldn't sour and give in to emotions, as an unbalanced state is dangerous for driving. Gathering all her willpower, she concentrated on the road. It was well past midnight when she opened her apartment door. Floriana didn't have time to flick the switch before she heard her father's voice. "Finally, you've arrived. I've been anxious all day after your call." Floriana rushed to her father and burst into tears. "Daddy, I almost made the biggest mistake of my life." Dr. Polono let his daughter cry, and when she calmed down, asked, "What are you going to do now?" The girl confidently said, "I know one thing for sure. There will be no wedding. For now, it's better to go through life alone than to marry a man who can betray you at any moment." The next morning, Floriana calmly informed David about her decision. The guy clearly didn't expect such a sharp reversal. He began to shout that it was all a lie, that the evil neighbours had slandered his good name, that he had no daughter, and that Laurie had fathered a child with an unknown lover. It was unpleasant to listen to all this, and Floriana only said, "You're so mean," and hung up. That same day she went to the registry office and withdrew their application for wedding. For some reason afterward, her soul felt lighter, as if cleared of unnecessary junk. David took the breakup painfully, besieging Floriana with constant calls. First he begged her to come to her senses, then he began to threaten. His parents joined the process of trying to salvage their son's happiness. Of course, the main actor was his mother, while his father silently agreed with his wife. 2 years have passed. Every minute, Floriana looked at the door, behind which Kevin Burnham had disappeared an hour ago. She knew that behind this austere door, real magic was happening. After all, her husband was a true magician, giving people back their ability to move and walk. "Floriana, will my mum be able to walk?" Hope froze in little Molly Brown's eyes. Floriana hugged the girl. "Mummy will definitely be able to walk. We just have to wait and believe." The little girl sighed heavily. "I can wait a whole day, even a whole year. Aunt Floriana, tell me, will Mummy's other leg be sewn back on?" "Who told you such nonsense? Your mum's not a rag doll who can replace an arm or a leg. She'll be fitted with a special device. Walk with it for a few months, and when it's removed, she won't need crutches anymore." Molly was deeply impressed by this explanation. "Just like in a fairy tale. When I grow up, I'll become a doctor like Dr. Kevin and Dr. Anthony. I'll fix children's legs when they break them." The girl began to speculate aloud about her distant future, her thin voice ringing eerily loud in the spacious corridor. Finally, the door Floriana was watching opened, and Dr. Burnham appeared on the threshold. With a joyful smile, he said, "Everything's fine, girls. We can register our first success." Molly ran up to the doctor. "Kevin, can I go to my mum?" Dr. Burnham stroked the little girl's smoothly coiffed head with undistinguished tenderness. "Let your mum sleep a little, and then you can visit her. In the meantime, you and Floriana can take a walk in the park. Fresh air is good for both of you." Floriana agreed with her husband. "Perhaps you're right, we should freshen up a bit." She held out her hand, and with his help, she stood up. "God, I'm getting as clumsy as a turtle." The man laughed. "If that's the case, I have to tell you that you're a very adorable turtle." Kevin stared at Floriana and said very quietly, "And there's an equally adorable little turtle inside." Floriana glanced pointedly at Molly. Kevin, mind what you're saying in front of the child. Not the least bit embarrassed, the little girl declared, You think I don't know anything? I know that little babies first grow in the tummy so they won't be stolen, and then they're born. The adults laughed with relief, and Kevin said, Smart little girl, that's an interesting theory you've come up with. Let me walk you to the exit, or you might get lost in the labyrinth of corridors in our clinic. Floriana was enjoying the spring sunshine, and Molly was having fun on the small playground located on the clinic grounds. She had already made friends and was telling them something enthusiastically. Floriana looked at the little girl, hardly believing this was the same child she had seen 2 years ago in an old house on the edge of an unfamiliar village. After the breakup with David, she had immediately gone searching for Laurie, whose existence she had learned about from David's neighbour. Although the village indicated by Mrs. Taylor was only a few kilometres away, Floriana spent half a day searching for this settlement. But the most shocking thing was that almost no one lived in that village. A few streets with houses boarded up windows presented a very dreary sight. There were no stores or other signs of civilization. The only bright spot in this dystopian picture was a little girl playing in the tall grass. For a few minutes, Floriana silently watched the child, not daring to approach. But a mature woman came out of a nearby house and asked in a formidable voice, What do you want? Floriana whispered, I'm looking for Carl Walsh. The woman cast her another unkind look. From the Social Security office or what? At last they've started dealing. I was about to complain. Soon it turned out that Laurie was the woman's niece, and she was in an almost helpless state. Due to inquiries, she had limited mobility, but the young mother wasn't given disability status, so her aunt had to handle everything herself. She began complaining to Floriana at once. If only I were younger. But I'm already in my 6th decade. My strength isn't what it used to be. Floriana asked about Laurie's father, and the woman burst into tears. He died last month. I'm all alone now. If something happens to me, my Laurie will be completely lost. Of course, after what she had seen, Floriana couldn't turn around and leave. She went to the house where she met Laurie. David's former fiancé didn't welcome the guest warmly either. Why did you come here? To enjoy my helplessness? Well, go ahead and admire. The young woman jumped out of her chair, forgetting about her crutches, and almost fell. Floriana managed to catch her in time. Laurie, I came for another purpose. I want to help you and your daughter. Laurie didn't relent. Did David send you? Does he want to make up for his guilt? Floriana pleaded. Laurie, calm down. Nobody sent me. David and I have parted ways. The young women talked for a long time, then cried together. Floriana stayed at Laurie's aunt's house for the night, leaving early the next morning. She told her father the sad story of the woman David had abandoned.
Anthony Polono said firmly,
We should take her to Dr. Burnham. I'm sure that Kevin will help her. In just one day, Laurie's fate changed. She had undergone several complex surgeries, but the belief that she would walk again gave her strength. Floriana, however, felt she needed to do more for her. Despite her pregnancy, she continued her law practice, planning to secure alimony from David Bailey for Molly's upbringing through the court. With all the evidence in hand, she only needed to await the trial.
Floriana shivered when she heard a voice behind her.
Ah, there you are, lawyer. She turned to see David's hateful look, but remained composed. Yeah, I'm here. Why have you shown up? David struck a defiant pose. I've come to tell you that you won't succeed. You can't pin someone else's brat on me. I know this is your way of getting back at me, but I'll never acknowledge this child. I'll deny everything. Floriana rose from the bench. David, everything's already proven. Laurie gave birth to your daughter. I also want to tell you that I thank God I figured you out in time.
She turned her back on her former fiancé and called out,
Molly, we have to go. Your mum's probably waiting for us by now. The girl looked at David with curiosity.
Floriana, who's that sir you were talking to?
Floriana answered indifferently.
Just a passerby. Come along now." For the first time, David felt the sting of remorse. He watched Floriana and the little girl running beside her, a deep pain taking hold. This unfamiliar feeling stunned him, leaving him at a loss for how to shake it off.